Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the frigid stone corridors of a medieval castle, but not as a knight or a noble lady draped in furs. No, tonight you're a baker, and let me tell you, you probably won't survive this if you don't know exactly where to sleep, what to wear, and how to trick your body into generating just enough heat to see another dawn. Picture this. It's February in the year 1347 somewhere in the English countryside. The castle walls are 3 feet thick, which sounds protective until you realise stone doesn't insulate it, absorbs cold and radiates it back at you like a malevolent frozen sponge. Your sleeping chamber sits adjacent to the kitchen complex, close enough to smell yesterday's roasted venison, but far enough that you won't accidentally incinerate yourself during the night. The temperature inside hovers somewhere between uncomfortably cold and, why are my eyelashes crunchy? So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing the global sleep squad checking in. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It's 3 in the morning, not the cozy 3 a.m. where you roll over in your memory foam mattress and drift back into dreams. This is the 3 a.m. where your body jolts awake because the ovens need you. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. First, we need to understand how you survived the night at all. Because here's the thing, medieval castles weren't designed for comfort. They were designed for defense, which means narrow windows for archers, minimal wood to prevent fire during sieges, and stone everywhere. Stone floors that suck warmth from your feet. Stone walls that weep with condensation. Stone ceilings that drip icy water onto your forehead while you're trying to sleep. You're a baker, which actually puts you in a surprisingly privileged position compared to most castle inhabitants. Not noble-level privilege, you don't have tapestries or braziers or servants to warm your bed, but baker privilege, which is its own peculiar category. See, your entire professional existence revolves around fire. You spend 12 to 16 hours a day managing roaring ovens kneading dough that ferments with metabolic heat. Moving constantly in the warmth of the bakehouse, your body has adapted. Your hands are calloused not just from work but from brief contact with hot surfaces. Your internal thermostat runs slightly higher than the average peasant's because you're chronically dehydrated and your metabolism burns fast from the physical labour. But when those ovens bank down for the night and the last loaves cool on their racks, your body faces a brutal reality. The castle doesn't care about your comfort. The lord and lady might have fur-lined bedchambers in the towers. The chaplain might have a small brazier in his quarters. The guards rotate shifts and warm themselves at watchfires. But you retreat to a narrow chamber, calling it a room, would be generous, built into the thick walls between the kitchen and the bakehouse. It's essentially a stone cavity, maybe 8 feet by 6 feet, with a single narrow window covered by a wooden shutter that doesn't quite fit its frame. There's no door, just a heavy wool curtain that blocks some of the draft. The floor is flagstone, relentlessly cold. And this is where you'll spend the next 4 to 5 hours hoping your preparation was sufficient. Historians still argue whether medieval people actually slept 8 consecutive hours like modern industrial schedules trained us to do, but we'll get to that fascinating debate later. For now, just know this. You're not climbing into bed thinking about rest. You're thinking about survival. Every night is a calculated gamble against hypothermia, and you're betting on a combination of body heat, strategic positioning, and the lingering warmth of brick ovens that haven't quite surrendered all their thermal energy to the indifferent stone around them. The year 1347 is particularly brutal. This is the tail end of the medieval warm period, giving way to colder decades, though you don't know that in climate science terms. You just know that your father, who was also a baker, swears the winters weren't this vicious when he was your age. Outside snow piles against the castle's curtain wall. Inside your breath forms visible clouds even in the relatively warm kitchen complex. The temperature in your sleeping chamber probably hovers around 40 degrees Fahrenheit on a good night. On a bad night, you've woken to find frost patterns on the interior walls, delicate ice crystals that would be beautiful if they weren't a harbinger of potential death. But you're still here. You survived last night, and the night before, and you'll survive tonight too because you've learned the tricks. You've absorbed the wisdom passed down through generations of castle bakers who face this same stone-cold darkness. You know exactly where to position your body relative to the oven wall. You know how many layers to pile on. You know which apprentice generates the most body heat and should therefore sleep in the middle. You know that the bakery cat, despite her ratty appearance and occasional hairballs, is worth her weight in gold as a living purring hot water bottle. So let's walk through your evening routine step by careful step, because this isn't just a story about sleeping. This is a story about the precise choreography of survival, performed every single night by people whose names history never bothered to record, but whose warm bread fed everyone from the lord to the lowest stable hand. Your sleeping chamber isn't random real estate. Every aspect of its location was calculated by someone who understood thermal dynamics long before anyone had vocabulary for convection currents or heat retention coefficients. The bakehouse occupies the northeastern section of the castle's inner ward, built directly against the curtain wall. This seems counterintuitive at first. Why put your heat source against the coldest, most exposed exterior wall? But there's genius in this madness. The ovens vent through chimneys that run up through that thick stone, and positioning the entire operation here means smoke doesn't drift into the Great Hall or the Lord's private chambers. More importantly for you, it creates a specific microclimate. Your chamber sits embedded in the wall between the bakehouse proper and the main kitchen. Think of it as inhabiting the filling of a stone sandwich. On one side, the massive bread ovens, twin behemoths built from fire brick and clay, each one large enough that you could crawl inside when they're cold for maintenance. On the other side, the kitchen's perpetual hearth, which never fully dies because the kitchen servants bank it overnight and revive it before dawn. You're sleeping in the thermal buffer zone between two heat sources. The wall on your left, the bakehouse side, radiates warmth for hours after the final baking. The wall on your right stays moderately warm from the kitchen's banked coals. It's not toasty, not even comfortable by modern standards, but it's survivable, which is the medieval definition of luxury. The ceiling above you is vaulted stone barely 6 feet high at its peak, which means you can't stand fully upright. This isn't architectural spite, it's actually beneficial. Lower ceilings trap warm air closer to your body. Heat rises, yes, but in a 6-foot space it doesn't have far to rise before it bounces back down. You've noticed that the few servants who sleep in the Great Hall with its soaring 30-foot timber ceiling always look more exhausted and cold-ravaged than you do. They're sleeping in a vertical thermal void where any warmth their bodies generate floats up into useless space. You're sleeping in what's essentially a horizontal chimney, and while it smells perpetually of smoke, yeast and sweat, it holds heat. The floor is flagstone like everywhere else in the castle, but here's where you've made modifications. Standard protocol would be rushes, dried reeds and grasses scattered across the stone replaced monthly if you're lucky, quarterly if you're realistic. Rushes provide minimal insulation, they harbour fleas, and they get damp from condensation dripping down the walls. You've negotiated something better, a base layer of straw compressed and packed tight, covered with 2 layers of old flour sacks that have been patched and repatched until they're more repair than original fabric. On top of that, sheepskins, 3 of them acquired through a combination of a legitimate payment and strategic friendship with the castle's shepherd. These aren't tanned and treated hides like the nobles use. These still smell distinctly of lanolin and sheep musk, especially when they warm up, but lanolin is waterproof and insulating. Your sleeping area is essentially a nest. The narrow window presents a constant negotiation. It's barely 8 inches wide and 12 inches tall, a defensive slit really designed for archers if the castle ever comes under siege. During daylight hours, you leave it unshuttered because you need ventilation. The bakehouse generates phenomenal amounts of smoke and carbon monoxide, and while most of it vents through the chimneys, enough seeps into your chamber that you'd suffocate without fresh air circulation. But at night you must shutter it, and here's the tricky part: the wooden shutter doesn't fit properly. There's a gap of maybe half an inch along the bottom edge. You've stuffed it with wool scraps, but wind still finds its way through, creating a blade of cold air that cuts across the chamber at knee height. Historians still argue whether medieval craftsmen were genuinely bad at making tight-fitting shutters, or whether the gaps were intentional for air circulation. But when you're trying to sleep and that draft is turning your leg numb, you don't particularly care about the architectural debate. You've learned to position your bedding perpendicular to the window so the draft flows past your feet rather than across your torso. Small adjustments matter when the margin between sleep and hypothermia is measured in degrees. The entry to your chamber is covered by a heavy wool curtain, dyed an indeterminate brownish colour from years of smoke exposure. It hangs from an iron rod wedged into the stone, and it overlaps the doorway by about 6 inches on each side. This curtain is communal property, meaning all 3 bakers who share this space contributed to its acquisition. It's heavy, maybe 15 pounds of felted wool, and it's your primary defense against the corridor drafts. The main corridor outside your chamber runs the length of the kitchen complex, and it's basically a wind tunnel. Cold air from the courtyard entrance pours down it all night long, seeking equilibrium with the warmer kitchen air. Without that curtain, you'd be sleeping in a constant breeze, but even with the curtain, cold seeps through. Stone is an excellent conductor of temperature, which means the freezing exterior walls gradually leach warmth from the entire structure. By 2 a.m., even your strategically positioned chamber surrenders some of its accumulated heat. The bakehouse wall, which felt pleasantly warm when you first lay down at dusk, becomes merely cool. The kitchen wall maintains a gentle warmth, but it's not enough on its own. This is why your sleeping arrangement involves other human bodies. The chamber technically has space for 2 people to sleep comfortably. 3 people sleep here. You and 2 apprentices, Thomas, who's 16 and built like a young ox, and Peter, who's 13 and skinny as a rake handle. The sleeping arrangement isn't random. Thomas sleeps in the middle because he generates the most body heat. You sleep on the bakehouse side because you're the master baker and get first choice of position. Peter sleeps on the kitchen side, which seems like the warm spot until you realise it's also closest to the curtain and the drafts that sneak around its edges. He's the youngest, the lowest in the hierarchy, so he gets the worst position. That's not cruelty, that's preparation. If he survives a few winters in the cold spot, he'll be hardy enough to eventually take your position when you're too old or dead. The whole chamber smells like a specific combination of scents that you stopped noticing years ago. Wood smoke, obviously. Stale yeast, sheepskin, and unwashed wool. The mineral smell of damp stone. Underneath it all, the human smell of 3 men who bathe maybe 4 times a year and sweat daily in front of roaring ovens. It's not pleasant if you think about it, but you don't think about it. This is what survival smells like. The concept of changing into night clothes would strike you as hilariously wasteful. Clothes are expensive, linen is expensive, wool is expensive. The idea of owning separate garments specifically for sleeping garments that serve no other function is something only the absurdly wealthy could contemplate. You sleep in what you wore all day with strategic additions. Let's inventory what's actually on your body as you settle onto those sheepskins, starting from the skin outward. A linen undershirt, or braise if we're being technical about medieval terminology. It's long-sleeved, reaching to mid-thigh, and it's the only garment that touches your skin directly. Linen is crucial here. It absorbs sweat during your workday and provides a thin barrier against the wool you'll pile on top. This undershirt is stained yellowish-brown under the arms and around the collar from months of wear. You wash it maybe once a month, and wash is a generous term for dunking it in cold water and beating it against a rock. It's developing holes near the hem, and you've already decided that when it finally disintegrates, you'll cut it up for wound bandages and negotiate with the castle's weaver for a new one. That negotiation will probably involve extra bread for her family for 3 months. Over the linen, a wool tunic. This is your primary garment, the medieval equivalent of both shirt and pants combined. It's a long pullover affair that reaches to just above your knees, belted at the waist with a rope. The wool is undyed, that oatmeal beige colour of natural fleece, and it's thick. Not the fine merino that nobles wear, this is the scratchy coarse wool from working sheep still containing bits of vegetable matter and lanolin. It itches against your wrists and neck where it contacts skin directly, but you barely notice anymore. This tunic is your primary insulation layer. Wool maintains warmth even when damp, which is critical, because you sweat constantly during the day and there's persistent condensation at night. The tunic has a story. You inherited it from the previous master baker when he died, probably of what we'd now recognise as a heart attack, though at the time everyone just said he fell over by the ovens and stopped breathing. His widow had no use for work clothes, and you were the obvious heir to his position. The tunic was too large initially, but you've grown into it over 5 years. There's a burn mark on the left sleeve from when you got too close to the oven door. There are flour stains that will never come out. The hem is scorched in several places. It smells permanently of smoke and yeast, a smell that's actually comforting now, the smell of your identity. Over the tunic, a second wool tunic. This one's shorter, more like a modern long vest, and you only put it on as evening approaches. It's darker brown, dyed with walnut husks, and it's newer. You purchased it last year with saved wages. Having 2 layers of wool creates dead air space between them, which is where the real insulation happens. The outer tunic also catches most of the bakehouse grime, which means your inner tunic stays relatively cleaner. This is strategic layering that won't be scientifically explained for another 600 years, but you understand it instinctively. On your legs, wool hose, which are basically individual leg tubes that tie to your belt. They reach from foot to upper thigh, and they're held up by leather straps called points. The hose are developing holes at the heels and knees, the points of greatest friction and wear. You've darned them multiple times with whatever scrap yarn you could scavenge, creating lumpy repair patches that rub blisters. But holy hose are better than no hose. At night you keep them on. Your legs need that wool barrier against the cold that seeps up from the stone floor through the sheepskins. On your feet the situation gets complicated. During the day you wear wooden clogs, or sometimes go barefoot in the bakehouse where flour dust and heat make shoes pointless. But for sleeping you've developed a specific system. First you wrap your feet in strips of linen, essentially medieval socks made from worn-out undertunics cut into bands. Then, and this is the clever part, you put on a second pair of wool hose over the first. Yes, 2 layers of hose. Your feet are the body part most vulnerable to frostbite because they're farthest from your heart and closest to the frozen floor. Double-hosed feet stay warmer longer and the outer layer can be damp from sweat without compromising the inner layer's insulation. Around your head, a wool cap. Always. Historians love to debate what percentage of body heat you actually lose through your head. Turns out it's not the 40% that folk wisdom claims, more like 10%, but in a freezing stone chamber, 10% matters enormously. Your cap is shapeless and felted from wear, pulled down over your ears. Sometimes on the coldest nights you'll wrap a scarf around your neck and lower face, breathing through wool. This creates a warm, moist pocket of air around your mouth and nose, though it also means you're inhaling wool fibres and waking up coughing. Now here's where it gets interesting, the addition specifically for sleeping. You have a cloak, a heavy wool rectangle about 6 feet by 4 feet, fastened at your throat with a simple iron pin. During the day it hangs on a peg near the ovens, soaking up residual heat. At night it becomes a blanket. You lie down, pull it over your body and tuck the edges under your sides to create a sealed envelope of wool. Thomas has his own cloak. Peter, being the junior apprentice, has a thinner one that's seen better days, which is part of why he needs to sleep between you and Thomas. His insulation is inferior. But wait, there's more. You also have access to a communal blanket, a massive felted wool thing that weighs probably 30 pounds. It's been in the bakehouse for decades, patched and repatched, stained with things you don't want to think about. This blanket goes on top of all 3 of you, spread across the sheepskins like a heavy tarp. The weight is part of the warmth it presses down, eliminating air gaps, creating pressure that feels oddly comforting. Modern weighted blankets are therapeutic luxuries. This medieval version is survival equipment that coincidentally provides the same deep pressure stimulation. Under this pile of wool, linen and sheepskin you've created a microclimate. Your body heat and Thomas's and Peter's gets trapped in the dead air spaces between fabric layers. The heavy blanket prevents convective heat loss. The sheepskins underneath prevent conductive heat loss to the stone. You're essentially a human burrito wrapped so thoroughly that turning over requires coordinated negotiation with your sleeping partners. And you dare not stick an arm or leg out into the open air because the temperature differential would shock you awake immediately. One more detail, you sleep with your belt on cinched tight around both tunics. This isn't about security or modesty, it's about maintaining core body heat. A tight belt around your waist helps prevent warm air from escaping out the bottom of your tunic layers, and cold air from creeping up. Its uncomfortable leaves marks on your skin, and makes certain bodily functions awkward, but it keeps your torso several degrees warmer. Medieval people understood that keeping your core warm was more important than extremity comfort. So there you are, double-hosed, double-tunicked, cloaked, capped, and communally blanketed, lying on sheepskins in a stone cavity, between 2 dying heat sources wrapped so thoroughly you can barely move. And this is how you'll spend the next few hours, breathing shallowly through wool, listening to Thomas snore and Peter's teeth occasionally chatter, waiting for your body to relax enough to sleep despite the persistent cold that probes for any gap in your defences. The moment you settle onto the sheepskins and feel Thomas and Peter shift into position beside you, a specific choreography begins. This isn't 3 men randomly sprawling across a shared sleeping space. This is a precisely calibrated system of heat exchange that you've refined over years of trial and error. Get the positioning wrong and someone wakes up hypothermic. Get it right and you all survive until dawn. Thomas lies in the middle as we established, but let's talk about why his position is so critical. He's 16, yes, but more importantly he's broad-shouldered and thick-muscled, from hauling 100-pound flour sacks and kneading massive dough batches. His body is a furnace. Young men at the peak of physical labour generate enormous amounts of metabolic heat, probably around 100 watts, when sleeping closer to 400 during the day. You've never heard of watts or calories or metabolism, but you know that Thomas feels perpetually warm to the touch, that he sweats even in winter, that he can work bare-armed in the bakehouse when you and Peter need extra layers. So Thomas becomes the anchor heat source. He lies on his back, which is the position that radiates heat most efficiently to the people flanking him. You position yourself on his left, your back to the bakehouse wall, lying on your side facing him. Peter mirrors you on the right, also on his side facing inward. This creates a configuration where both you and Peter can press your fronts against Thomas's sides, maximizing skin-to-fabric contact. Your wool-covered chest absorbs warmth from his wool-covered torso. Peter does the same on the opposite side. But there's more geometry involved. Your legs don't stay straight, that would waste potential contact area. Instead, you bend your knees slightly, and Peter bends his, and you both hook your lower legs over Thomas's legs. 3 sets of wool-hosed limbs interweave like a puzzle. Your feet, double wrapped, remember, end up somewhere near Thomas's shins. Peter's feet press against Thomas's other shin. Thomas's feet, being in the middle of this configuration, stay warmest because they're insulated by 4 other legs. Your heads are close enough that you can hear each other breathing. Sometimes you can feel Thomas's breath on your cap if he turns his head. It's intimate in a way that would be strange if you thought about it, but you don't think about it. This is survival, not affection. You've slept this way beside Thomas and Peter, and before Peter beside Martin, who left to marry a miller's daughter for so many nights that their presence is simply part of the sleeping process. The sound of Thomas's heavy breathing is actually comforting. It means he's alive, warm-producing carbon dioxide that mingles with yours under the communal blanket. Now, the communal blanket deserves its own attention. When you first lie down, someone, usually you, because you're the master baker, and this is your responsibility, spreads it carefully over all 3 bodies. It has to cover from shoulders to feet with no gaps at the edges. You tuck the sides under your bodies, creating a seal. The wool is so heavy that it takes effort to arrange, but that weight serves multiple purposes. It presses the 3 of you together more tightly, eliminating air gaps. It prevents the cold chamber air from circulating under the blanket. And psychologically, it provides a sense of security like the walls of a wool cocoon. Under this blanket, a specific microclimate develops. Within 20 minutes of lying still, the temperature inside your wool envelope rises. Not dramatically, maybe from 40 degrees ambient to 55 or 60 degrees. That's still cold by modern standards, but it's survivable. Your bodies are producing heat faster than it can escape through the wool layers. The air trapped between the blanket and your cloaks becomes a thermal buffer. You can feel the difference if you accidentally create a gap cold air rushes in like water through a breach in a dam. But here's the challenge: you can't stay perfectly still all night. Human beings shift positions naturally during sleep, usually a dozen or more times. Every shift threatens to compromise the thermal seal. If Thomas rolls onto his side, suddenly one person loses their primary heat source. If Peter accidentally kicks the blanket loose at the bottom, cold air floods in around everyone's feet. If you unconsciously pull your cloak tighter around yourself, you might create a gap that exposes Thomas or Peter to the chamber air. So you've developed a semi-conscious protocol for shifting positions. When Thomas needs to turn over and at 16 sleeping on his back all night would be torture for his spine, he announces it. Not loudly, just a quiet turning mumbled into the darkness. You and Peter automatically adjust, maintaining contact as he rotates from back to side. If he turns to face you, you scoot backwards slightly. If he turns away, you press closer to his back. Peter does the inverse. The goal is never to lose thermal contact. Even a 6-inch gap between bodies becomes a cold zone that makes everyone miserable. Historians still argue whether medieval people were actually more tolerant of crowded sleeping conditions, or whether they simply had no choice. But honestly, you can't imagine sleeping alone. The few times you've been sick and quarantined to sleep separately, usually when there's concern you might have something contagious. The isolation is terrifying. Not emotionally terrifying, but physically. Without other bodies generating heat, you shiver uncontrollably, even under extra blankets. Your body seems to need the presence of other humans to regulate its temperature properly. Solo sleeping would feel like being set adrift on an ice floe. Peter, being 13 and skinny, suffers more than you or Thomas. You can hear it in his breathing on the coldest nights, that slight catch, the way his teeth sometimes chatter in the first hour after lying down. His body simply doesn't have enough mass to generate and retain heat efficiently. This is partly why you and Thomas tolerate his restless fidgeting. He's constantly adjusting, trying to burrow deeper against Thomas, pulling his cloak tighter, curling into a tighter ball. You remember being 13, and working as an apprentice yourself, remember that gnawing cold that seemed to originate from inside your bones. Peter will either survive enough winters to build the muscle mass and cold tolerance he needs, or he won't. That sounds brutal, but it's simply true. Sometimes on the worst nights you implement an emergency configuration. All three of you abandon the side-by-side arrangement and instead lie front to back like spoons in a drawer. You're in back because you're smallest, Thomas in the middle, Peter in front. You press your chest against Thomas's back, your knees against the back of his knees. Thomas does the same to Peter. This configuration minimizes exposed surface area. Each person's back is warmed by the person behind them, and each person's front faces the slightly warmer kitchen wall. The trade-off is that it's harder to breathe under the blanket in this position, and someone's face inevitably ends up pressed into someone else's smoky-smelling hair or neck. But it works. You've survived nights this way when frost formed on the inside of your stone walls, when your water pitcher froze solid, when you could see your breath even under the blanket. The physical closeness also serves another function. You'd never articulate emotional security. The darkness in your chamber is absolute. There are no streetlights, no digital clocks casting glow, no light pollution filtering through curtains. When the kitchen servants bank the hearth and the last coals die down, your world becomes perfectly, utterly black. The kind of darkness that feels tangible, like you could reach out and touch its substance. In that darkness, with the wind howling outside and the castle making its nighttime sounds, timbers creaking stones, contracting in the cold, distant footsteps of night guards. The warmth and breathing of other humans nearby is profoundly comforting. You're not alone. You're pack animals huddling together against the night. And there's one more benefit to communal sleeping that nobody discusses, but everyone understands security. If someone stops breathing, someone else will notice. If someone develops a fever or starts shivering uncontrollably, help is immediate. If someone has a nightmare and cries out, hands are there to steady them. The medical reality of medieval life means sudden death is always possible, infection, stroke, heart failure, even just succumbing to cold. Sleeping communally means you're less likely to die alone in the darkness undiscovered until dawn. So there you lie, three wool-wrapped bodies pressed together on sheepskins, sharing breath and warmth, and the slow journey towards sleep, hoping that the ovens have retained enough heat in the wall beside you, that the kitchen hearth is banked properly, that the blanket stays in place, that everyone's circulation keeps functioning, that dawn will come before the cold defeats you. The bakehouse ovens are characters in your life, not just tools. They have personalities, temperaments, moods. The larger one, everyone calls it Big Thomas, though not to young Thomas's face, is reliable and even-tempered, holding heat, for hours after the fires die. The smaller oven, Little Devil, burns hotter but cools faster, temperamental as a spoiled hound. Your entire sleeping survival strategy revolves around understanding exactly how these brick beasts release their accumulated thermal energy through the night. Let's talk about the engineering, though you'd never use that word. Each oven is built from firebrick special clay bricks that can withstand extreme temperatures, without cracking, laid in a domed shape about 6 feet in diameter and 4 feet high. The walls are 18 inches thick. That's crucial. 18 inches of dense brick absorbs staggering amounts of heat during the day's baking cycles and releases it slowly, gradually, predictably over the following hours. The wall of your sleeping chamber that backs onto Big Thomas is actually the oven's exterior wall, and by evening that stone is too hot to touch comfortably with a bare hand. Your final task before sleeping begins around 2 hours after the last loaves come out. The ovens are still radiating serious heat, maybe 400 degrees inside, declining, but still dangerous. You and Thomas bank them properly, which means using long-handled rakes to distribute the remaining coals evenly across the oven floor, then closing the iron doors and sealing them with clay paste around the edges. This traps the heat inside rather than letting it escape through the door gaps. It's counterintuitive, maybe, why not leave the doors open to heat the bakehouse? But sealed ovens retain heat in the brickwork much longer, which means warmer walls adjacent to your sleeping chamber throughout the night. By the time you actually lie down, usually around what we'd call 8 p.m. though, you measure time by church bells and darkness, Big Thomas's wall has cooled from scalding to pleasantly warm. If you press your wool-covered back against it, the heat soaks through the fabric into your muscles. It feels genuinely wonderful, like a heated blanket someone's laid across your spine. This is the warmest you'll feel all night, and you savour it consciously, knowing what's coming. The heat transfer follows predictable patterns you've learned through observation. During the first hour of sleep, what you'd call your first sleep phase, the wall maintains strong warmth. Your back stays comfortable, almost cozy. The wool of your tunic absorbs heat and creates a warm zone between your skin and the fabric. This warmth radiates forward through your body, contributing to the overall microclimate under the communal blanket. You and Thomas and Peter fall asleep relatively easily during this phase because your bodies aren't fighting to generate all their own heat. During the second hour, the wool transitions from warm to tepid. Still warmer than ambient air, definitely warmer than the flagstone floor, but no longer radiating heat you can feel through wool. Your back stays comfortable, mainly because it's insulated from the chamber air. The oven wall is now functioning more as a thermal barrier than a heat source, preventing the exterior cold from penetrating through the castle's curtain wall into your chamber. By the third hour, this would be around 11 p.m. The wall reaches what you think of as neutral temperature. Not cold, not warm, just there. If you press your hand against the stone now, it feels slightly cool, pulling heat from your palm rather than providing it. This is when the communal sleeping arrangement becomes critical. The oven wall is no longer helping you. You're entirely dependent on metabolic heat from 3 human bodies and the insulation of wool and sheepskins. The fourth hour is when things get precarious. The wall has cooled enough that it's actually leaching warmth from your body. Stone is an excellent heat sink. It absorbs and conducts heat away from warmer objects in contact with it. You start unconsciously shifting away from the wall, trying to minimize contact. But you can't shift too far or you'll create gaps in the sleeping configuration. So you compromise rolling slightly forward to reduce your back's contact area with the stone while maintaining pressure against Thomas's side. By the fifth hour, somewhere around 2 a.m, the oven wall is as cold as the rest of the chamber. All that accumulated heat from the day's baking has dissipated into the surrounding stone, radiated out through the castle walls, risen up through the chimney, escaped through the tiny gaps around the shutter. The thermal advantage is gone. This is the coldest part of the night, the dangerous hours before dawn, when body temperature drops naturally and the castle itself seems to contract in the cold, groaning and cracking. But here's what you've figured out through years of experience: the thermal pattern is predictable enough that you can position your sleeping palette to maximize benefit. You don't sleep directly against the oven wall that would be too hot initially and too cold later. Instead, your sheepskins are positioned about 8 inches away from the wall. This creates an air gap that moderates the temperature extreme. When the wall is hottest, the air gap prevents overheating. When the wall is coldest, you've already shifted forward away from it anyway, so the gap doesn't matter. You've also learned exactly where along the wall to position yourself. The wall isn't uniformly warm. The section directly behind the oven's dome retains heat longest. That's where the hottest fire burned, where the most bricks absorb the most energy. The sections near the oven's base and near the chimney opening cool faster. So your head and torso area aligns with the optimal warm zone. Your feet, which are less sensitive and have double hose protection, end up nearer the cooler section. This isn't accidental. You've made tiny adjustments over months, moving your bedding an inch this way or that until you found the sweet spot. Little Devil, the smaller oven, has its own thermal personality. It cools much faster, probably releasing most of its heat within 3 hours. But it's positioned such that its warmth contributes to the kitchen side of your chamber where Peter sleeps. This is actually strategic. Peter, being coldest, gets proximity to the kitchen hearth, which burns all night at low level. The combination of hearth warmth and Little Devil's residual heat keeps that side of the chamber slightly warmer than it otherwise would be. Not warm enough to make up for Peter's lack of body mass, but every degree helps. Historians still argue whether medieval builders consciously designed these thermal relationships, or whether people just adapted to whatever spaces they got, but honestly, the answer. The previous master baker and the baker before him, and probably the baker who first worked when this castle was built, they all figured this out through cold, uncomfortable experimentation. Someone slept in the wrong spot and suffered. Someone else tried a different position and survived better. Knowledge accumulated. You're the beneficiary of decades of trial and error conducted by men whose names you don't even know. There's something almost comforting about this thermal decline through the night. It's predictable. You know that when your back starts feeling cool rather than warm, it's been about 2 hours. When you feel the first urge to curl tighter into Thomas's warmth, it's been 3 or 4. Your body becomes a clock measuring time through temperature gradients, and you know with absolute certainty that when the cold reaches its peak, and you're contemplating whether you'll actually survive until dawn, that's when something else happens, something your body does naturally that medieval people understood intimately, but modern humans have almost forgotten. You wake up. Not fully, not into panic, but into a different kind of consciousness. And that's when the real midnight survival rituals begin. Around midnight, give or take an hour, your body doesn't keep precise time, your eyes open in the absolute darkness. This isn't insomnia, this isn't a sleep disorder. This is your body doing exactly what human bodies did for millennia before electric lights and industrial schedules convinced everyone that sleep should be one unbroken 8-hour block. You're experiencing what scholars will eventually call segmented sleep, or biphasic sleep, though you just think of it as the waking time. Your first awareness is the darkness, total, complete, thick as wool. You can't see your hand if you hold it an inch from your face. The narrow window is shuttered. The kitchen servants have banked the hearth so thoroughly that no light seeps under your curtain, and the bakehouse is equally dark. This is the darkness that humans evolved, sleeping in no moon, no stars penetrating your stone cavity, nothing. Your eyes are open but receiving zero visual information, which creates a strange sensation of floating in void. Your second awareness is the cold. During your first sleep, your body temperature dropped naturally as it does for everyone in deep sleep. You're maybe 1.5 degrees cooler than your waking temperature. The chamber has continued cooling. The oven wall is now neutral or slightly cold against your back. The tip of your nose exposed to the air above the blanket feels like ice. Your breath creates a tiny warm pocket inside your wool cap and scarf, but beyond that microclimate the air is harsh. Thomas is still asleep beside you, breathing heavily, occasionally snoring. Peter is also asleep on Thomas's other side. You can hear his lighter, faster breathing. They'll wake soon too, following their own internal rhythms, but for now you're alone with your consciousness in the darkness. And here's the thing, this doesn't frighten you. This is normal. This is when you do the quiet work of surviving. You don't leap up. Movement must be careful, calculated. You slowly extract one arm from under the communal blanket, and your personal cloak feeling cold air bite at your wool-covered forearm. The temperature differential is shocking, maybe a 30-degree difference between under blanket and chamber air. You reach out in the darkness, your hand finding the stone wall through pure spatial memory. You've done this hundreds of times. Your fingers walk along the wall until they find what you're looking for, a small shelf carved into the stone, and on it a clay cup of water. The water isn't frozen, but it's close, maybe 34 degrees. You bring the cup carefully back under the blanket, letting it warm slightly in the wool environment before you drink. Hydration is crucial. You lost water through breathing all evening. Each exhale carried moisture that froze as tiny ice crystals on your wool scarf. You need to replace that fluid, but drinking ice-cold water would shock your system and make you colder. So you wait holding the cup against your wool-covered chest, letting your body heat transfer through this clay into the water. After a few minutes, it's merely cold rather than glacial, and you drink carefully, small sips making sure not to spill on the bedding. While you drink, you do a mental and physical inventory. Fingers, can you feel all of them? Wiggle them. Yes. Toes harder to assess through double hose and wool wrappings, but you flex them and feel the response. No numbness, no tingling that might indicate frostbite. Ears, you touch them through your cap, feeling for that waxy coldness that precedes frostbite. They're cold but pliable. No similar check. Everything is functioning. You've survived the first half of the night. Now you address your bladder, which has been sending increasingly urgent signals. This is one of the miseries of winter sleeping that nobody romanticizes. You have 3 options. Option 1, hold it until dawn and risk extreme discomfort or even bladder damage. Option 2, get up and walk down the dark corridor to the garderobes, essentially holes in the floor that drop waist down into the castle moat, and risk losing all your accumulated body heat, plus potentially falling on icy flagstones in the darkness. Option 3, use the chamber pot. You choose option 3 as you almost always do. The chamber pot lives in the corner of your sleeping chamber, a simple clay vessel with a lid. You extract yourself carefully from the bedding, trying not to disturb Thomas and Peter, though Thomas stirs and mumbles something unintelligible. The moment you're out from under the blanket, the cold attacks. Even through all your wool layers it penetrates. You move quickly, feeling your way to the corner in total darkness, locating the pot by memory and touch, and handling your business as fast as possible. The pot will be emptied in the morning. That's one of Peter's duties as the junior apprentice. For now, you replace the lid and hurry back to the bedding, burrowing under the blanket and pressing against Thomas's sleeping form. He's radiating heat like a banked fire, and you're shivering from your 30-second exposure to the chamber air. It takes several minutes for your shivering to subside for the wool layers to recapture your body heat. But now you're awake, properly awake, and this is when the midnight work happens. You lie still listening. This is part of your responsibility as master baker. You're listening for sounds that would indicate problems, the most feared sound, the crackle of uncontrolled fire. If a coal somehow escaped the banking process, if sparks found their way into flour dust or straw, fire could be spreading right now through the wooden parts of the kitchen complex. You hear nothing alarming, just the wind outside, the occasional crack of contracting timber, somewhere in the castle the scurrying of rats in the walls. You're also mentally planning tomorrow's work. How much flour is left? You counted sacks before bed, but now you review the inventory in your mind. 38 sacks of wheat flour, 12 of rye, 5 of barley. The Lord is entertaining visitors next week, which means fancy white bread, which means you'll need to requisition more wheat from the stores. You make a mental note to speak with the steward. You also remember that one of the mixing troughs has a crack that's getting worse. You'll need to patch it with beeswax and cloth before it splits completely. This mental work isn't optional. You don't have paper and ink for notes. Everything must be held in memory. The waking time is when you review, plan, calculate. It's when you remember recipes passed down from your predecessor. It's when you think through the logistics of feeding a castle full of people who expect bread at every meal. Your mind is clearest now in the cold and dark without the distractions of daytime work. Historians still argue whether segmented sleep was universal or just common, whether it was biologically natural or culturally imposed, but you're not interested in the debate. You just know that everyone you've ever met who works before dawn, bakers' dairy maids, guards on night watch, experiences this same wakeful period. It's as natural as breathing. Your body knows that one long stretch of sleep isn't possible when you go to bed at dusk and must wake before dawn. Breaking sleep into 2 segments with a wakeful period in between is simply how human consciousness functions in the winter darkness. You also use this time for prayer, though your prayers are simple and practical. You whisper them into the darkness, barely voicing the words protection for Thomas and Peter, gratitude for the warmth of the ovens, a request that tomorrow's bread rises properly, a plea that you'll survive the winter. You're not especially devout, but prayer provides structure to the silence. The words are comforting through repetition, and there's always the chance that Saint Honoré, patron saint of bakers, might actually be listening. Gradually, maybe after 30 or 40 minutes of this quiet wakefulness, you feel sleep returning. Your thoughts become less linear, more dreamlike. Your body temperature has stabilized. The cold has stopped penetrating so aggressively you've reached an equilibrium. Thomas shifts in his sleep, turning onto his side, and you automatically adjust your position to maintain contact. Peter coughs once a dry sound, then settles again. The wind outside rises and falls, and slowly, gradually, without any conscious decision, you drift back into your second sleep. This second sleep will be deeper than the first, though shorter. It will carry you through until around 3 a.m. when your body clock, trained by years of the same schedule, jerks you awake for real. But for now you're sinking back into unconsciousness, your last thought a vague satisfaction that you've survived another midnight, that the chamber is still standing, that the cold hasn't won yet. The midnight waking time isn't just for bodily maintenance and mental planning, it's also when you perform quiet rituals that blur the line between practical necessity and superstition. In the darkness, with only the sound of breathing and the castle's nocturnal creaks, the boundary between the physical world and something else feels thinner. You're not especially superstitious, not by medieval standards anyway, but you're also not foolish enough to ignore practices that have kept bakers alive for generations. First there's the matter of the dough. Yes, even at midnight, even in the freezing darkness, the dough concerns you. Somewhere in the bakehouse, covered with damp linen cloths, and positioned near the residual warmth of the ovens, your starter dough is slowly fermenting. This is the leaven that will transform tomorrow's flour and water into risen bread, a process that feels almost magical, even though you've witnessed it thousands of times. The dough is alive in a way you don't fully understand. It breathes it, grows, it can sicken and die if treated poorly. During your wakeful hour, you sometimes rise carefully, quietly, and feel your way through the darkness to the bakehouse. You don't need light for this. Your feet know every flagstone, every threshold. Your hands find the work table, then the cloth-covered bowl. You lift the cloth slightly, letting your fingers hover above the dough's surface. You can feel the warmth it generates through fermentation, smell the yeasty tang. If the dough feels too cold, you might move it closer to the oven wall. If it feels too warm rare in winter, you might move it away. This isn't written in any recipe. This is knowledge that lives in your fingertips. While you're checking the dough, you also whisper to it. Not loudly, just a murmur, "Rise well, be strong, feed us tomorrow." It sounds absurd when articulated plainly, but everyone does it. Every baker you've ever known talks to their dough. Maybe it's the isolation of the midnight darkness. Maybe it's the lingering pagan belief that bread is sacred, that the transformation of flour into food involves forces beyond human control. Maybe you're just lonely, and the dough is there living and breathing under its cloth. You don't analyze it. You just do it the same way your predecessor did, the same way his predecessor did. Back in your sleeping chamber, you perform another small ritual checking the bread horseshoe. Nailed above your curtain-covered doorway, invisible in the darkness but located precisely in your spatial memory, is an iron horseshoe you found in the courtyard 3 years ago. You reach up and touch it, feeling the cold metal, the rust texture. Horseshoes bring luck, everyone knows that. More specifically, they protect against malevolent spirits and ill fortune. The blacksmith blessed this one before you mounted it, muttering words in Latin you didn't understand. Whether it actually works is irrelevant. The gesture of touching it in the midnight darkness makes you feel slightly safer. You also keep a small pouch of salt tucked into a crevice in the stone wall near your sleeping place. Salt is precious, expensive, magical purifying. A pinch of salt thrown over your left shoulder wards off bad luck. Salt sprinkled across a threshold prevents evil from entering. Your pouch contains maybe a tablespoon of salt hoarded from your wages, and once during this wakeful period, you touch the pouch, just confirming it's still there. You've never actually used this salt for warding, it's too valuable to waste, but knowing it exists provides comfort. Then there's the matter of Saint-Honoré. In the bakehouse, there's a small carved wooden figure of the saint, barely 6 inches tall, positioned on a shelf above the ovens. During the day, you barely think about it. But at night, during the wakeful time, you sometimes pray to him more directly. Not formal prayers from the liturgy, you don't know those well, but personal conversations. Saint-Honoré, the flour is running low. Help me make it stretch. Or, Saint-Honoré, Peter is coughing more. Keep him healthy enough to work. Or simply, Saint-Honoré, let me see spring again. These prayers feel more sincere in the darkness. During daylight, with the ovens roaring and work demanding attention, prayer feels like an obligation, words recited by rote. But at midnight, cold and vulnerable prayer becomes something else, reaching out across the darkness towards something that might be listening, might care, might help. You're not sure you believe in saints the way the priest says you should, but you believe in the comfort of asking for help when you're alone and frightened. You also listen during this wakeful time to the castle itself. Every building has sounds, but castles have vocabularies. You've learned to interpret the language. That low groan, that's the north tower contracting in the cold timber and stone compressing. That sharper crack, that's ice forming in the water channels that run through the walls. That distant thud, that's probably a shutter blown loose somewhere banging in the wind. That skittering sound, rats in the granary, hopefully not getting into the flour stores. But sometimes there are sounds you can't immediately identify, and those create tension. Is that footsteps in the corridor or just your imagination? Is that a voice or wind through the arrow slits? Medieval castles are haunted by acoustics. Sounds travel through stone passages in strange ways, arriving distorted and sourceless. You've learned not to panic at unexplained sounds, but you never entirely relax either. The darkness hides many things. On the coldest nights, you can hear something else, the breath of everyone sleeping in the castle. Not literally, of course, you can't hear through multiple stone walls, but there's a quality to the silence that feels inhabited. Somewhere the lord and lady are sleeping in their fur-lined bed. Somewhere guards pace the walls, stomping their feet against the cold. Somewhere servants huddle in the great hall sharing warmth. Somewhere horses shift in their stables, dogs curl in corners, cats hunt rats through the darkness. The castle breathes as a collective organism, and you're one small cell within it. This awareness of collective survival is strongest during the midnight waking time. During the day, social hierarchies are rigid. You're a baker, beneath the steward, and far beneath the nobility, but above the stable hands and field workers. At midnight, in the cold and darkness, those distinctions feel less important. Everyone is just trying to survive until dawn. The lord in his tower is fighting the same cold, you're just with better weapons. The continuity of that shared struggle feels almost intimate. You also think about the dead during this wakeful time. They're present in ways they aren't during daylight. You remember the previous master baker, the one whose tunic you inherited. You remember his voice explaining how to judge oven temperature by the colour of the bricks. You remember the way he'd slap dough with a particular rhythm. He died 5 years ago, but at midnight in the darkness he feels closer than memory usually allows. Sometimes you imagine you can hear his breathing alongside Thomas's and Peter's. Sometimes you whisper questions to him. Did I bank the ovens correctly? Will the rye flour last through next week? Historians still argue whether medieval people actually experienced more supernatural encounters, or just interpreted ordinary phenomena differently, but you know the answer doesn't matter. Whether the previous master baker's spirit actually lingers in the bakehouse, or whether you're just talking to your own memories, the comfort is the same. The dead aren't frightening at midnight. They're companions in the darkness, reminders that others survive these same cold nights, that your struggle is part of a continuous chain stretching back generations. You also sometimes think about the future during this wakeful time. Will you live to see Peter become a master baker? Will Thomas take over this position when you're too old? Will you die in the bakehouse like your predecessor collapsing by the ovens? Or will you get some warning, some gradual decline that lets you prepare? Medieval life doesn't encourage long-term planning. Death arrives too suddenly, too randomly, but at midnight with nothing else to occupy your mind, you can't help projecting forward into the uncertainty. Eventually these thoughts become less structured, more dreamlike. Your mind drifts from prayer to memory to planning to fantasy without clear boundaries. You imagine being warm, truly warm, not just not freezing, but warm the way you feel on summer afternoons in the sun. You imagine eating hot soup without having to ration it. You imagine a world where bread bakes itself, and you can sleep through entire nights without waking. These fantasies are pleasant, but also slightly dangerous. Too much imagining of comfort might make the present cold harder to bear. So you let the thoughts disperse like smoke. You focus on the immediate Thomas's warmth beside you, the weight of the wool blanket, the sound of breathing in the darkness. You count breaths yours, Thomas's, Peter's, letting the rhythm lull you. You consciously relax your jaw, your shoulders, your hands, each muscle group releasing its tension. And gradually, without noticing the exact moment of transition, you slip back into sleep, the second sleep, the deeper one that will carry you through until the pre-dawn waking when real work begins again. The straw mattress underneath you isn't really a mattress in any sense you'd recognise if you time-travelled forward 700 years. It's a cloth sack, heavy linen, patched multiple times, stuffed with loose straw, flattened by months of body weight into something more like a lumpy mat than bedding. When it was fresh, maybe 8 weeks ago, it had loft and spring. You could press down and feel resistance, feel the straw compressing, then pushing back. Now in late winter, it's compressed into a dense pad maybe 2 inches thick, at its thickest points 1 inch, in most places, and essentially nothing where your hip bones and shoulders press down most heavily. This compression is a serious problem that goes beyond mere comfort. Compressed straw loses its insulating properties. When straw is fresh and loose, the individual stalks create thousands of tiny air pockets, dead air spaces that trap warmth and prevent heat from conducting away from your body into the cold stone floor beneath. But as straw gets compressed by weight and moisture, those air pockets collapse. The stalks pack together, creating dense mats that conduct cold rather than insulating against it. You can actually feel the difference. Where the mattress is thickest under your torso, there's some barrier between you and the stone. Where it's thinnest near your feet and head, you might as well be lying directly on flagstone. The moisture problem makes everything worse. Human bodies release moisture constantly through breathing, through skin, through the inevitable dampness of winter living. That moisture condenses on cold surfaces, including the underside of your straw mattress, where it contacts the frigid stone floor. Over weeks, the bottom layer of straw becomes damp, then wet, then develops that distinctive sour smell of mildewing plant matter. This damp straw is worse than no straw at all. It actively pulls heat away from your body through evaporative cooling and thermal conduction. You've learned to check the mattress weekly during winter, feeling the underside for dampness because a wet mattress can literally kill you through hypothermia. Maintenance is therefore crucial. Every 7 to 10 days, weather permitting, you and Thomas haul the mattress sacks outside into whatever sunlight exists. You untie the openings and spread the straw on dry ground, letting sun and air reach the damp bottom layers. You pick through it, removing the mouldiest stalks, the ones that have gone slimy or black with rot. You fluff the remaining straw, trying to restore some airspace, though once straw is compressed, it never fully recovers its original springiness. You turn the sacks inside out to air them, You check the seams for tears where straw might leak out. This maintenance is boring cold work, your hands go numb, handling damp straw in February wind, but it's absolutely necessary. Every 2 to 3 months, ideally, you need completely fresh straw. This requires negotiation with the stable master because straw is a limited resource. The horses need it for bedding. The Great Hall needs it for floor covering. Every servant in the castle wants fresh straw for their sleeping arrangements. Your leverage as a baker is significant. The stable master likes bread. Everyone likes bread. You can offer extra loaves, but you're still competing against dozens of other demands. So you've developed relationships. You help the stable boys with certain tasks. You remember the stable master's name day. You make sure his family gets the occasional honey-sweetened roll. Politics and bread are deeply intertwined. When you do get fresh straw, it's a genuinely wonderful night. The mattress sack stuffed tight with new dry springy straw feels luxurious. You sink into it. It cradles your body. The insulation is immediately noticeable. The cold from the floor doesn't penetrate nearly as aggressively. That first night on fresh straw, you actually sleep more deeply, wake less often, feel more rested at dawn. Thomas always grins when you acquire fresh straw. Peter, who's young enough to still express delight openly, sometimes laughs and burrows into the new bedding like a dog. These small pleasures matter enormously, but fresh straw brings its own problems. Loose straw hides things. You've found at various times mouse nests with pink blind baby mice, shed snake skins, beetles, spiders, and once memorably a small bird that had somehow gotten trapped in the stable and died in the straw pile. You now pick through new straw carefully before stuffing it into the mattress sacks, but you never catch everything. So the first few nights on fresh straw often involve discovering what's living or decomposing within it. You've learned to accept this. The alternative, refusing fresh straw because it might contain unpleasant surprises, would be insane. The mattress arrangement also affects the sleeping configuration. You don't have 3 separate mattresses. That would waste straw and create gaps where cold air could circulate. Instead, you have essentially one large mattress sack, perhaps 6 feet by 4 feet, with 2 smaller ones positioned to extend the sleeping area. The large sack occupies the centre, and that's where Thomas sleeps, because he's the heaviest and needs the most support. You and Peter sleep partially on the smaller sacks, partially on the sheepskins laid directly over stone. This arrangement keeps all 3 bodies in close contact while distributing weight to prevent any single area from compressing too quickly. The sheepskins on top of the straw are their own maintenance challenge. Sheepskin is wonderful waterproof thanks to lanolin insulating, even when damp durable. But it requires care. The lanolin needs to remain in the skin, which means you can't wash sheepskins with water and lye soap the way you might wash fabric. Instead, you clean them by beating them with sticks to knock out dirt and flour dust, then airing them in whatever sun appears. The skins develop their own ecosystem, bits of straw embedded in the fleece flour dust ground into the wool-dead skin cells and hair, from 3 humans, probably mites and fleas, though you try not to think about those. Once during your wakeful midnight period you became convinced that fleas were biting you under the blankets. You spent 20 minutes in the darkness searching your wool layers for the tiny insects, catching what you thought was one, and crushing it between your thumbnails, hearing the satisfying pop that confirms a flea death. Whether you actually had fleas or whether the itching was psychological or just dry winter skin you never determined. But the incident reminded you that your bedding is a living environment inhabited by many organisms beyond just you, Thomas and Peter. Historians still argue whether medieval people were actually more tolerant of parasites or simply had no effective way to eliminate them. But you know it's the latter. You hate fleas. You hate lice. You hate bedbugs. You just don't have good options for preventing them. Washing your wool clothing and bedding is difficult, requires resources, and doesn't necessarily kill parasite eggs. The castle's resident cats help by eating some fleas, but they also bring in new ones. You've tried various folk remedies, sprinkling wormwood around the sleeping area, hanging bundles of aromatic herbs, rubbing your skin with certain oils with mixed, and probably mostly psychological results. The bedding also accumulates smells. Smoke smell, obviously, that never leaves. Sweat smell, less obvious, because you're accustomed to your own scent. The lanolin smell of sheepskins, which is slightly rancid and animal. The straw smell, which is pleasant when fresh but becomes musty as it ages. The wool smell, which is different from lanolin, earthier, more mineral. And underneath all of this, something harder to define, the smell of human habitation of bodies that rarely bathe of breath and skin, and the oils secreted by scalps of feet that spend all day in wool hose of clothes worn until they disintegrate. To you, this smell is just how things smell. You don't notice it most of the time, but occasionally when you step outside into the sharp, clean air of a winter morning, then return to your chamber, you catch it, the concentrated human-animal smoke straw smell of your sleeping space. It's not pleasant exactly, but it's not repulsive either. It's familiar. It's home. And on the coldest nights when you burrow deep into the wool and sheepskin and straw, that concentrated smell becomes almost comforting, because it's associated with survival, with warmth, with making it through another night. The maintenance schedule for all this bedding is essentially constant. Weekly, turn the mattress, beat the sheepskins, check for tears and dampness. Monthly, acquire new straw if possible, patch any holes in the fabric, search for and eliminate any obvious parasite infestations. Quarterly, completely remake the sleeping area, repositioning everything, evaluating what needs replacement. This work falls partially to you as the master baker, but also to Peter as the apprentice, and even Thomas contributes despite his higher status. It's communal maintenance of communal survival equipment. And on those rare occasions when everything is fresh, simultaneously new straw recently aired, sheepskins, wool blankets that have been beaten free of dust, even your clothing somewhat cleaner than usual, the sleeping experience transforms. Not into luxury, not into anything a noble would recognize as comfort, but into a version of peasant comfort that feels genuinely good. The bedding smells better, the insulation works better, your skin doesn't itch as much, you sleep more deeply. These moments remind you that your normal sleeping conditions are actually somewhat miserable. You've just adapted so thoroughly that you've stopped noticing. But you notice when things improve, and you savor those nights knowing they're temporary, that the straw will compress again, that the dampness will return, that the eternal cycle of decay and maintenance will continue. Because that's what winter survival is, managing decay. Everything is trying to break down, straw compressing, sheepskins deteriorating, wool felting and tearing your own body, wearing down from cold and work. Your job is to slow that decay enough to make it through until spring, when the cycle can reset, when warmth returns, when survival becomes slightly less of a daily calculation. Before you even think about sleep, there's the evening meal to consider. Not the elaborate supper the nobility enjoys in the Great Hall, but the baker's version of sustenance that serves a dual purpose: calories for warmth and a specific kind of internal heating that lasts through the night. What you eat in the hours before lying down directly affects whether you'll survive the cold with minimal suffering or wake up multiple times shivering and miserable. The timing matters. You finish the day's baking somewhere around what we'd call 6 p.m, though you measure time by the fading light and the church bells calling vespers. Your body is exhausted from 12 hours of physical labour, depleted of energy, running on fumes. This is precisely when you need to refuel, but not with just anything. You need foods that provide sustained energy release, that generate metabolic heat, that sit heavy in your stomach and digest slowly through the night. The foundation is always ale. Not the strong ale that gets people drunk in taverns, but small beer weak ale, maybe 2-3% alcohol brewed from the second or third rinsing of malted barley. Every castle brews this constantly because water isn't reliably safe to drink. The brewing process kills pathogens and the slight alcohol content preserves it. But for you, ale serves another crucial function: its liquid calories. A large wooden cup of small beer contains sugars from the malt, some residual nutrients from the grain, and crucially, it's consumed warm. Yes, warm. You don't drink cold ale before sleeping in winter, that would be insane. Instead, there's a large pot of ale kept near the kitchen hearth, gently warming but not boiling. You ladle out a generous portion, maybe a pint, and drink it slowly while your body is still warm from working near the ovens. The warm ale enters your stomach and radiates heat from the inside. You can feel it spreading through your torso, a pleasant warmth that's almost intoxicating in itself. The mild alcohol creates a subtle relaxation, taking the edge off the day's stress without making you drunk. Medieval people understood that moderate alcohol before sleep was medicinal, even if they didn't have the vocabulary for terms like muscle relaxant or anxiolytic. But ale alone isn't enough. You need solid food, and specifically you need fat and protein. The castle's evening meal for servants typically includes some form of pottage, thick soup or stew made from whatever ingredients are available. In winter, this usually means onions and leeks from storage-dried peas, or beans, barley or oats as thickener, and if you're lucky, some meat. Not the roasted venison or pork the nobility eats, but scraps the bits deemed unworthy of the Lord's table. Grislien's organ meats, bones with scraps of meat still clinging to them, fat trimmings. These scraps are actually perfect for your purposes. Fat is the most calorie-dense food available, providing 9 calories per gram versus 4 for protein or carbohydrates. A chunk of pork fat, even if it's from an undesirable cut, will keep your internal furnace burning for hours. You've learned to specifically request fattier portions, and the kitchen servants who ladle out the pottage know this. Extra fat for the baker is understood. You work near intense heat. You burn calories faster, you need the fuel. The pottage arrives in a wooden bowl steaming with a chunk of coarse bread for soaking up the liquid. You eat it slowly, sitting on a bench near the kitchen hearth, still wearing all your work clothes. The heat from the food combines with the ambient warmth from the hearth to raise your core body temperature. This is strategic. You're preheating yourself before entering the cold sleeping chamber. Your body temperature is probably a degree or two above normal right now, and that buffer will help as you settle into the cold bedding. Thomas and Peter eat beside you, going through the same ritual. Thomas, being young and enormous, gets even larger portions. He can consume staggering amounts of food, sometimes 2 full bowls of pottage, plus multiple cups of ale, plus half a loaf of bread. His metabolism runs like a forge. Peter, being smaller and younger, eats less, but makes every bite count, chewing, slowly savouring the warmth. There's something companionable about this shared evening meal, even though you're all too tired to talk much. Just the presence of warm food, warm drink, and other human bodies. Sometimes, if it's been a good week, or if you've bartered successfully, there are additions to the basic pottage. A handful of dried herbs, sage, thyme, rosemary added by the cook, making the soup more aromatic and supposedly more healthful. Medieval medicine believes strongly in the balance of humours, and certain herbs are considered warming in nature, perfect for winter consumption. Whether they actually generate heat or just taste good is irrelevant. The psychological comfort of warming herbs adds to the overall effect. Occasionally there's honey. This is a treasure strictly rationed expensive, but the castle's steward understands that bakers need special consideration, so perhaps once a week you might get a small spoonful of honey to stir into your warm ale. Honey provides quick energy, simple sugars that hit your bloodstream fast, but more importantly, it's delicious. The sweetness is almost shocking after days of bland pottage. You let it dissolve slowly on your tongue, trying to make the sensation last. Honey also has a folk reputation for promoting good health and warding off winter illnesses, though you're not sure if that's true or just wishful thinking. On the best nights there might be garlic. Garlic is considered powerfully medicinal. It wards off evil spirits, prevents illness, strengthens the blood, and most importantly for your purposes, it's believed to generate internal heat. Whether this is physiologically true or placebo effect doesn't matter. When you eat a soup heavy with garlic, you feel warmer. Your skin might flush slightly. You certainly smell strongly of garlic afterward, but so does everyone else, so nobody notices. The kitchen servants sometimes roast whole garlic bulbs near the hearth and distribute cloves to the workers. You eat them like candy, the roasted flesh sweet and creamy, the sharp garlic bite mellowed by heat. There's also the question of timing your last consumption. You've learned through trial and error not to drink too much liquid right before lying down that guarantees you'll wake with an urgent bladder, forcing you out of the warm bedding into the freezing chamber. But you also can't stop drinking too early, or you'll wake up dehydrated, your mouth dry, your throat scratchy. The sweet spot is to have your final cup of warm ale about 30 minutes before actually lying down, then making one last trip to the garderobe before settling in for the night. Historians still argue whether medieval diets provided adequate nutrition, especially for working people in winter, but you know the answer from your own experience: barely adequate. You're always slightly hungry. There's never quite enough fat, never quite enough meat, never quite enough variety. You sometimes fantasize about eating an entire chicken by yourself, or a bowl of nothing but butter or a pie filled with meat and gravy. These fantasies are pointless. Such abundance is impossible, but they occupy your mind during the evening meal, making the thin pottage seem even thinner by comparison. But you've also learned that hunger has degrees. There's the sharp, painful hunger of having eaten nothing all day that's dangerous, that impairs your ability to work and survive. Then there's the dull background hunger of having eaten enough to function, but not enough to feel truly satisfied. That's just normal life. You exist in that second state constantly. The evening meal takes you briefly out of hunger into something approaching satiation, and you appreciate that transition even if it's temporary. The meal also serves a social function. This is when you hear castle news who's sick, what supplies are running low, whether the lord is planning any changes that might affect the bakehouse. The kitchen servants gossip freely and you listen while eating. You learn that the lady of the castle is pregnant again, that one of the guards got drunk and fell off the wall. He survived, that there's talk of reducing ale rations to make the barley last until spring. This last piece of information concerns you deeply if ale rations drop your evening warming ritual becomes harder to maintain. After eating, there's a brief period of lethargy. Your body is diverting blood flow to your stomach to aid digestion, which makes you drowsy. This is actually ideal. You want to be sleepy when you lie down, not wired and alert. The combination of physical exhaustion from work, the warming effect of food and drink, and the drowsiness of digestion creates perfect conditions for sleep. You just need to transition from the warm kitchen area to the cold sleeping chamber before you lose that accumulated warmth. So you rise from the bench, thank the cook or kitchen servants with a nod, and make your way toward the bakehouse and your adjacent sleeping chamber. Thomas and Peter follow. The corridor is cold, you feel it immediately, the temperature drop like walking into a wall. But you're still warm internally, your stomach full and radiating heat. You move quickly, not wanting to lose this advantage. And as you duck through the curtain into your chamber, you're carrying with you not just the physical warmth of the meal, but the metabolic fuel that will keep your body generating heat through the dark hours ahead. Your hands tell the story of winter survival better than any chronicle. Hold them up in the dim light of a tallow candle, if you had a candle to spare, which you usually don't, and you'd see a landscape of damage. The fingertips are rough, the skin thickened into calluses from handling hot baking surfaces and coarse flour sacks. But it's the other damage that matters more, the small cracks at the knuckles that never fully heal the redness around the nail beds, the white patches on the fingertips that signal the beginning stages of frostbite damage that's accumulated over years. Chilblains are your constant companion from November through March. These are the itchy, painful swellings that develop when cold skin is warmed too quickly. Exactly what happens to a baker who works in freezing conditions, then plunges his hands into warm dough or near hot ovens. Your fingers swell, turn reddish-purple itch so intensely that you want to tear the skin off. Scratching makes it worse, breaking the skin and inviting infection, but the itch is sometimes unbearable. You've learned to recognize the early signs, that tingling sensation, when your cold hands first encounter warmth, the way your fingers feel tight and swollen inside your gloves. The only real treatment is prevention, which means keeping your hands from getting too cold in the first place. But that's nearly impossible when you live in a stone castle and work with your hands constantly, so you manage the damage instead. In the evening before sleep, you sometimes rub your hands with a mixture of lard and crushed herbs. The kitchen servants make this salve for anyone who asks. The laird creates a barrier against moisture loss, and the herbs, usually calendula or comfrey, supposedly promote healing. Whether the herbs do anything medicinal or just make the lard smell less rancid, you're not sure. But the act of rubbing your hands, massaging the swollen joints provides some relief. Your feet suffer even worse. Inside your double-layer wool hose, your toes are cramped damp from sweat that has nowhere to evaporate and cold despite the wool. Over the years, you've developed permanent damage to your smallest toes on both feet. They're slightly discoloured, a greyish-white colour that never fully goes away even in summer. This is old frostbite-damaged tissue that died partially years ago, during a particularly brutal winter when you were an apprentice. The toes still function mostly, but they have reduced sensation. You can't feel temperature as accurately in those toes, which is actually dangerous. They might be freezing right now. And you wouldn't know until the damage was severe. You check your feet during the midnight wakeful period, pulling them carefully from the wool layers and feeling them with your hands. Temperature check. Are they cold to the touch? Colour check. Any white or blue patches that would indicate current frostbite. Sensation check. Can you feel pressure when you press on each toe? This examination happens in total darkness by touch alone, your fingers reading your feet like a manuscript. If you detect serious problems, extreme cold numbness, complete loss of sensation, you'd need to take emergency action. That might mean waking Thomas and Peter to generate more body heat, or even getting up and walking around the chamber to force blood flow into your extremities, or in extreme cases going to the kitchen to warm your feet near the banked hearth. But those extreme measures cost you warmth and sleep, so you try to prevent problems before they become emergencies. This means positioning your feet carefully in the bedding. Your feet go in the warmest zone between your body and Thomas's body, protected by both your leg heat and his. You also learned years ago to flex your toes periodically, creating muscle movement that generates small amounts of heat and maintains blood flow. This happens semi-consciously. During sleep, your body knows to move your toes even when your brain is unconscious. Peter suffers more than you or Thomas because he's young and thin with less body mass to generate heat. You can hear him sometimes in the darkness, making small sounds of discomfort when the cold gets particularly aggressive. His feet are probably in worse condition than yours, though he never complains openly. Complaining would mark him as weak, potentially unfit for the work. But you've noticed he limps sometimes in the morning, that his hands shake more than they should when handling equipment. Youth doesn't protect against cold damage. Sometimes it makes you more vulnerable, because you haven't developed the coping mechanisms and scar tissue that come with years of exposure. There are folk remedies for frostbite and chilblains passed down through generations of cold-suffering peasants. Rubbing snow on frostbitten skin, which sounds insane but supposedly helps by slowly rewarming tissue. Soaking feet in urine, the warmth and ammonia supposedly promote healing, though this mostly just makes you smell terrible. Wrapping affected areas in wool soaked in wine or vinegar. Applying poultices made from turnips or onions. You've tried most of these at various times with mixed results. Some probably work through legitimate mechanisms, keeping tissue warm, promoting blood flow. Others are pure superstition. But when you're desperate and in pain, you'll try anything. The castle's elderly have the worst cold damage. You've seen servants who've worked here for decades, whose hands are gnarled claws, whose feet are permanently damaged, who've lost fingertips or toes to severe frostbite. There's an old woman who works in the laundry, she must be 50 ancient by medieval standards, whose hands are so damaged that she can barely grip things. Her fingers are stiff, bent at odd angles, the skin shiny and scarred. She can still work somehow, but her hands are a warning of what awaits anyone who survives long enough in these conditions. You sometimes wonder if you'll live to be that old, and if so, what your hands will look like. Will you lose fingers? Will the chilblains eventually become something worse, infected wounds, gangrenous tissue requiring amputation? Medieval medicine has limited answers for cold injuries. The best the castle's healer can offer is warming poultices, prayer, and hope that the body heals itself. If infection sets in, you might lose the affected part. If the infection spreads, you might die. It's that simple and that terrifying. Historians still argue whether medieval people were actually tougher and more pain-tolerant, or whether they simply had no choice but to endure, but you know the answer: both. You've developed higher pain tolerance because you've had to. The constant low-level discomfort of cold-damaged hands and feet becomes background noise, something you barely notice, unless it spikes into acute pain. But you're not superhuman. You suffer. You just suffer quietly and keep working, because the alternative is starvation or dismissal from your position. There's also the question of the long-term health effects. You don't have the vocabulary for Raynaud's disease or peripheral neuropathy, but you understand that your hands and feet don't work as well as they used to. Your grip strength has declined. You drop things more often. Your toes don't provide the same balance feedback they once did. These are progressive changes worsening year by year, and there's nothing you can do to stop or reverse them. This is just what happens to bodies that endure chronic cold exposure. During the evening before sleep, you sometimes spend a few minutes exercising your hands, opening and closing your fists, rotating your wrists, massaging each finger. This isn't vanity or self-care in any modern sense. This is maintenance of your primary work tools. Your hands are how you earn your living. If they become too damaged to knead dough or handle hot pans, you're finished as a baker. So you maintain them the way you'd maintain any essential equipment grudgingly, because you have no choice. You also try to keep your hands and feet as dry as possible, which is nearly impossible. Sweat condensation, the moisture that pervades everything in winter. Your extremities are always somewhat damp. Damp will lose its insulating properties. Damp skin develops cracks and infections more easily. Damp conditions promote fungal growth. You've had athlete's foot, you've had infections between your toes, you've had the skin between your fingers crack and ooze. These aren't major medical crises individually, but cumulatively they wear you down, making you more vulnerable to serious problems. The irony is that summer brings different problems. Your cold-damaged tissue doesn't regulate temperature well, so when it's hot your hands and feet swell and ache. The scar tissue pulls and itches. You can't win winter damages, summer reminds you of the damage, and the cycle continues year after year, until eventually something breaks permanently or you die. But tonight, as you settle into the bedding and tuck your double-hosed feet into the warmest zone, you're not thinking about long-term consequences. You're just hoping your toes will still have feeling when you wake up at 3 a.m, that the chilblains won't itch so badly that you can't sleep, that the cracks in your knuckles won't split open when you start kneading tomorrow's dough. Small hopes, immediate hopes, the only kind that matter when you're trying to survive another night. The sleeping arrangement isn't democratic. It's a precise social hierarchy, made visible through body placement, where you sleep relative to the heat sources, who gets the thickest part of the mattress, how much of the communal blanket you can claim. These aren't accidents or casual choices. They're markers of status carefully maintained, occasionally contested and understood by everyone in the bakehouse as fundamental to the social order that keeps the operation functioning. You as the master baker get first choice of position. This means you sleep on the side nearest the bakehouse wall closest to Big Thomas the oven in the zone that stays warmest longest. Your section of the mattress is the best maintained because you control access to fresh straw. When the communal blanket is positioned, you get to ensure it covers your shoulders and feet adequately, before considering anyone else's needs. This isn't selfishness, it's the privilege that comes with your position, earned through years of apprenticeship and survival and maintained through your superior skill and knowledge. Thomas the apprentice occupies the middle position, which seems advantageous. He's sandwiched between two heat sources, protected on both sides, and that's partially true. But the middle position also comes with obligations. He's the communal heat source, the human furnace that keeps you and Peter alive. His body heat doesn't belong entirely to him, it's shared property. He can't shift away if someone's cold feet are pressed against his legs. He can't roll over freely without coordinating with both sleeping partners. He surrenders some autonomy in exchange for the security of his position as the valued apprentice who'll likely inherit the master baker role someday. Peter gets the worst position nearest the curtained doorway, closest to the drafts furthest from the oven's residual heat. His section of the mattress is the thinnest and least maintained. When the communal blanket inevitably shifts during the night, he's the first to lose coverage. This isn't cruelty or neglect, it's pedagogy through adversity. Peter is learning whether he has the constitution to survive as a baker. If he can endure winters in the cold spot, if his body adapts and toughens, he'll eventually earn a better position. If he can't, if he gets sick repeatedly, if frostbite damages him too severely, if he simply can't tolerate the discomfort, then he'll wash out of the profession before investing more years in training. This hierarchy extends beyond just sleeping position. It governs everything in the bakehouse. You get the warmest spot when working near the ovens. You get first access to food. When there's a single cup of warm ale left, it goes to you. Thomas gets second priority in all things. Peter gets whatever remains. This isn't arbitrary tyranny. It's a system that ensures the most valuable person, you with your irreplaceable knowledge and experience, stays healthy and functional. If you get sick or die, the entire bakehouse operation suffers. The Lord loses his bread supply. Thomas and Peter might lose their positions. Everyone has an interest in keeping you alive and functional. But the hierarchy also creates tensions, especially on the coldest nights, when suffering is acute and fairness seems arbitrary. You can sense Peter's resentment sometimes, the way he shifts away from the draft and tries to encroach on Thomas's space, seeking just a few more inches of warmth. Thomas, caught in the middle, occasionally resists pushing back against Peter while trying not to disturb you. These micro-conflicts happen silently through body language and positioning, never spoken aloud but constantly negotiated. There are unwritten rules about blanket distribution. If you're cold and pull more blanket toward yourself, you're expected to do it slowly, gradually, so the others can adjust. Sudden blanket theft that exposes someone else to the cold air is a serious violation. Similarly, if you need to shift position and might disturb the sleeping arrangement, you're supposed to move carefully, minimizing disruption. Thomas, being young and sometimes restless, occasionally violates this rule. He'll roll over abruptly or kick in his sleep or unconsciously pull the blanket. You've learned to tolerate minor violations from him, because his heat production is too valuable to risk losing through conflict. Peter has almost no leverage to negotiate better treatment. As the lowest ranked, his needs are secondary. If he's cold, the solution is to press closer to Thomas, not to complain or demand more blanket. If he's uncomfortable, he endures silently. His only path to better conditions is time survive, enough winters prove your value, outlast the competition, and eventually you'll earn a higher position when someone dies or leaves. Medieval social mobility is limited, but within small hierarchies like the bakehouse it exists. Peter looks at you and sees his possible future. You look at Peter and remember your own years as the cold apprentice in the worst sleeping position. The hierarchy also governs who handles the least pleasant tasks. Emptying the chamber pot, Peter's job. Checking for rats in the straw, Peter's job. Getting up to investigate strange noises in the night, Peter's job, unless the situation seems genuinely dangerous, in which case you might rouse yourself. This distribution of unpleasant duties is partially about rank, but it's also practical. Peter is youngest and theoretically recovers fastest from sleep disruption. Making him handle midnight problems in theory preserves your and Thomas's sleep quality. Historians still argue whether medieval social hierarchies were accepted peacefully or constantly contested, but in your experience it's complicated. The hierarchy is mostly accepted because everyone understands its logic and benefits. You were once in Peter's position, shivering in the worst spot, resenting the master baker who slept in comfort. But you also understood that if you proved yourself worthy, you'd eventually inherit that comfortable position. The system is harsh, but not entirely unfair. It rewards survival and skill, not just birth or luck. However, there are moments when the hierarchy strains. When Peter is visibly suffering, shaking with cold teeth, chattering audibly, there's moral pressure to help him. You or Thomas might shift position to share more warmth or pull the blanket to cover him better, even at cost to your own comfort. These acts of mercy reinforce the social bond and remind Peter that while the hierarchy is real, it's not absolute cruelty. You're all in this together, survival is communal, and helping the weakest member ultimately helps everyone. There's also a gendered aspect to this hierarchy that you rarely think about because it's so normalised. All three of you are male. Women in the castle, servants' kitchen, workers, laundresses have their own sleeping arrangements, their own hierarchies, their own struggles with cold. You don't interact with those systems much. The bakehouse is a male space, and its particular hierarchy reflects masculine values, physical strength, endurance, the ability to tolerate discomfort without complaint. If a woman were trying to survive in the bakehouse, the hierarchy would need to adjust, though you're not sure how. The question doesn't arise because gendered labour divisions keep women out of most bakehouse positions. Peter occasionally tests the boundaries of the hierarchy. He might accidentally take more than his share of blanket or shift his position to claim a few inches of better mattress space. These small rebellions are usually ignored if they're subtle, but if he becomes too aggressive, if he genuinely tries to displace Thomas, or encroach on your space correction, is swift. Not through violence, but through the withdrawal of small kindnesses. Thomas might shift away, leaving Peter colder. You might claim more blanket aggressively. The message is clear. Know your place, accept your position, wait your turn. Yet the hierarchy also provides security. Peter knows exactly where he stands, what's expected of him, what he needs to do to advance. There's no ambiguity, no false promises of equality. The rules are transparent and consistently enforced. In a world where so much is uncertain, will you have enough food? Will you survive the winter? Will plague or war or accident kill you? The clarity of social hierarchy is actually comforting. You know your role, you perform it, you reap the appropriate rewards or punishments. The sleeping arrangement is thus a nightly reenactment of social order. The way you position your body, share warmth, distribute blankets, it's all a physical manifestation of the power structures that govern waking life. And everyone participates willingly because the alternative to hierarchy would be chaos. Without clear rules about who sleeps where and gets what resources, you'd have constant conflict, reduced cooperation, and probably more deaths from cold. The hierarchy, harsh as it seems, actually facilitates survival by eliminating ambiguity and conflict over scarce resources. So you settle into your privileged position against the oven wall, satisfied that the social order is maintained, that your years of suffering in worse positions have earned you this relative comfort. Thomas relaxes in the middle, content with his role as the valued heat source. And Peter, cold and uncomfortable, but not quite miserable, accepts his position and dreams of the day when he'll occupy a warmer spot in the hierarchy of survival. The bakery cat is not technically yours. She belongs to no one and everyone, a semi-feral creature who lives in the castle's perpetual twilight between domestic and wild. She has no name, or rather she has many names, depending on who's addressing her. You call her Mouser. Thomas calls her Smoke because of her grey-brown colouring. Peter probably has his own private name for her but has never shared it. She doesn't respond to any of these names anyway, so it hardly matters. What matters is that on cold nights she becomes a vital sleeping companion. A cat's normal body temperature runs about 102 degrees Fahrenheit, several degrees warmer than human body temperature. This might not sound significant, but when you're trying to survive a 40-degree chamber, a warm-blooded creature pressing against your chest or stomach becomes an extra heat source. Not a huge one, she weighs maybe 8 pounds, but every degree matters. The cat understands this too. She's not sleeping with you out of affection or loyalty. She's using your body heat just as you're using hers. It's a mutual survival arrangement, transactional and unsentimental. She appears sometime after you've settled into the bedding, materializing from the darkness with that uncanny silent movement cats possess. You can't see her approach, but you hear the faint padding of paws on stone, then feel the subtle shift in air pressure as she leaps onto the bedding. She walks across the wool blanket, her small paws creating barely perceptible pressure points as she navigates the landscape of 3 sleeping humans. Her whiskers brush against your face. You flinch slightly at the unexpected touch, and then she settles. Usually on your chest or stomach, sometimes in the crook of your arm, occasionally pressed against your side. The settling process takes a few minutes. She circles, kneading the wool with her paws, that rhythmic press that cats do. You can hear the faint sound of her claws catching in the fabric. Then she curls into a tight ball tail wrapped around her body nose, tucked under her tail, for maximum heat retention. Within moments, you feel the warmth radiating from her compact form through your wool tunic. It's a small point of heat concentrated like holding a warm stone. You adjust your position slightly to maximize contact, bringing your arm closer to cradle her without actually restraining her. Cats hate being restrained, and she'll leave if you grip too tightly. The benefits aren't just thermal. There's something psychologically comforting about the cat's presence. Her purring when she purrs, which isn't every night, creates a gentle vibration you can feel through the wool and linen layers. The sound is soothing, repetitive, a biological lullaby. Even when she's not purring, her breathing provides a rhythmic sound, distinct from human breathing, something else alive and warm in the darkness. It makes the chamber feel less empty, less hostile. But the cat is also a liability and a nuisance in specific ways. She's a working animal, a mouser, which means she frequently catches and consumes rats and mice. This is her job, the reason the castle tolerates her presence. But it also means she occasionally brings trophies to the sleeping area. You've woken more than once to find a dead mouse on the blanket near your head, the cat's offering, or perhaps her way of storing food for later. The first time this happened, you recoiled in disgust. Now you just brush the corpse onto the floor and go back to sleep. It's protein for the cat, which keeps her healthy and warm and willing to sleep with you. She also has fleas. Definitely has fleas. Every cat in the castle has fleas. You have fleas too, probably, though you try not to think about it. The cat's presence likely increases your flea burden, but the warmth she provides outweighs the annoyance of occasional bites. This is the medieval calculation: comfort versus parasites, warmth versus disease risk. The cat wins because freezing to death is a more immediate threat than flea-borne illness. Sometimes the cat leaves in the middle of the night. You'll wake during your midnight wakeful period and realize she's gone off hunting, or patrolling her territory, or doing whatever mysterious activities cats perform in darkness. Her absence creates a noticeable cold spot on your chest where her warmth was. You feel slightly abandoned, though you know she'll return maybe before dawn, maybe not until the next evening. Cats are unreliable partners, but that's part of their nature. You can't command or control them. You can only create conditions that make them want to stay and hope they choose you. Thomas occasionally gets cat visits too. She might start the night on your chest, then migrate to Thomas's stomach partway through, attracted by his superior heat production. You feel irrationally jealous when this happens, though you'd never admit it. The cat chose you first, and her defection to Thomas feels like betrayal, even though you understand it's purely thermodynamic. Thomas is warmer, the cat goes where the heat is. Simple as that. Peter almost never gets cat visits. His position is too cold, his body heat insufficient. The cat has standards. There are occasional conflicts over the cat's presence. If she positions herself such that she's stealing blanket coverage, or if her weight is uncomfortable, or if she's kneading your stomach too aggressively, those claws are sharp. Even through wool, you might try to shift her. She usually resists. Cats don't take direction well. You have to negotiate carefully, slowly moving her a few inches without startling her into leaving entirely. Sometimes this works, sometimes she leaves in feline offense tail high, and doesn't return that night. You immediately regret your attempt at repositioning. A slightly uncomfortable cat is better than no cat at all. Historians still argue whether medieval people actually had the same emotional relationships with animals that modern people do, whether they saw pets as companions or purely as working animals. But the truth is somewhere in between. The cat is definitely a working animal. She earns her keep by killing vermin. You don't feed her, she feeds herself on rats. But there's also genuine affection in the relationship, unspoken and unsentimental, but real. You like having her warm weight on your chest. You appreciate her independence and competence. When she purrs, you feel something like happiness, or at least contentment. The cat is also a status symbol of sorts. The fact that she chooses to sleep with the bakers rather than with other castle inhabitants suggests your sleeping area is relatively warm and comfortable. Cats are discerning. They seek out the best spots. Her presence validates that you've created a survivable microclimate. If your chamber were truly miserable, the cat would find better accommodations elsewhere. There are other animals in the castle that provide warmth to their human associates. The stable hands sleep near the horses, absorbing heat from those massive bodies. The shepherd occasionally brings a sheep inside during brutal cold snaps. Dogs sleep with various servants, their larger bodies providing more heat than a cat, but also taking up more space and requiring food that cats don't need. You've considered getting a dog for the bakehouse, but dogs are needier, require more management, and might interfere with bread production. The cat is perfect, independent, small, useful, warm enough. Sometimes multiple cats cluster in the bakehouse area, drawn by the residual oven heat and the abundance of mice attracted to spilled flour. On those nights, you might have 2 or even 3 cats in the sleeping area, distributed among the 3 humans. It becomes a warm, purring pile of mammals, medieval and primal, everyone using everyone else's body heat in a web of thermal exchange. Those are the best nights, the nights when survival feels less like a struggle and more like a cooperative venture across species. The cat's presence also reminds you that you're not at the top of the survival hierarchy. The castle supports hundreds of lives, human and animal, wild and domestic, all interconnected through food webs and heat exchange and territorial relationships. You occupy a middle position above the rats the cat kills, below the nobles. The bread feeds parallel to the cat herself. Everyone is just trying to survive the winter. The cat's nightly choice to curl on your chest is her endorsement of your survival strategy. As long as she keeps choosing you, you must be doing something right. So you lie there in the darkness, the cat's warmth seeping through wool into your skin, her slight weight, a reassuring pressure, her occasional movements reminding you that you're not alone. Tomorrow she might not come. Tomorrow she might choose Thomas instead. But tonight, for these hours, she's yours. And that small purring point of heat makes the vast cold of the chamber feel just slightly more bearable, makes survival feel just slightly more possible, makes sleep come just slightly easier. There are nights when the standard sleeping arrangement simply isn't enough. Nights when the wind howls through the arrow slits with a sound like souls in torment, when frost forms on the interior walls despite the stone being 3 feet thick, when your breath creates clouds so thick you can barely see Thomas beside you, even if there were light to see by. On those nights, maybe a dozen times each winter, you abandon the sleeping chamber entirely and retreat to the bakehouse itself. This decision isn't made lightly. Moving to the bakehouse means admitting defeat, acknowledging that your carefully constructed sleeping arrangement has failed. It also means disruption, discomfort, and the loss of whatever marginal rest you might have gotten in the chamber. But when the alternative is genuine risk of freezing to death, pride becomes irrelevant. You've seen what happens to people who stubbornly refuse to adapt to extreme cold. They don't wake up in the morning, their bodies stiff and blue, their survival instincts overruled by some combination of exhaustion and hypothermia-induced confusion. The bakehouse after dark is a different world than during working hours. The ovens have been banked for hours, but they're still radiating significant heat, more heat than penetrates through the wall into your sleeping chamber. The air temperature in the bakehouse might be 55 or 60 degrees, a full 15 degrees warmer than the sleeping chamber. This doesn't sound like much, but when you're operating at the margins of survival, 15 degrees is the difference between miserable sleep and deadly exposure. The decision to move usually happens during your midnight wakeful period. You wake shivering despite the blankets and communal body heat, your teeth chattering, your extremities numb. You do a quick assessment. Can you survive the next 4 hours in these conditions? The honest answer is maybe, but maybe isn't good enough. So you whisper to Thomas, moving to the bakehouse. He grunts acknowledgement, already half awake because he's shivering too. You shake Peter's shoulder until he rouses. Bakehouse. You tell him. He nods, understanding immediately what this means. The transition is miserable. You have to leave the marginal warmth of the bedding, wrap the communal blanket around your shoulders, and shuffle through the cold corridor into the bakehouse. The flagstone floor is like ice beneath your double-hosed feet. The air bites at your face and any exposed skin. For those 30 seconds of transition, you're genuinely at risk, your body temperature drops, your shivering intensifies. You question whether this move is actually safer than staying put. But then you enter the bakehouse and the temperature differential hits you immediately. It's warmer. Not warm, there's no fire burning, no active heat source, but warmer. The ovens are still radiating the brick walls, holding onto their accumulated thermal energy with admirable stubbornness. You can actually feel the heat emanating from Big Thomas as you walk past, like standing near a large sleeping animal. The sleeping arrangement in the bakehouse is improvised and uncomfortable. There are no mattresses here, no sheepskins laid out for comfort. The floor is swept clean of flour dust. You maintain cleanliness religiously to prevent vermin infestation, but it's still hard flagstone. You spread the communal blanket on the ground as close to the ovens as you dare without risking burns. Then you layer your individual cloaks on top, creating a thin cushion between bodies and stone. The three of you lie down in the same configuration as in the sleeping chamber, Thomas in the middle, you and Peter flanking him. But now you're positioned to maximize proximity to the ovens. Your back is maybe 2 feet from Big Thomas's brick exterior, close enough that you can extend a hand and touch the warm surface. The heat radiates into your spine, your shoulders gradually penetrating through the wool layers. It feels glorious after the brutal cold of the sleeping chamber. Peter positions himself near Little Devil, the smaller oven, trying to capture whatever residual heat it still offers. Thomas in the middle benefits from both ovens' radiation, plus the body heat from you and Peter. This configuration works surprisingly well. Within 20 minutes you've all stopped shivering. Your muscles relax. The desperate clawing cold that made sleep impossible in the chamber recedes to mere discomfort. But sleeping on stone is its own special torment. No matter how you position yourself, some part of your body is pressed uncomfortably against the unyielding surface. Your hip bones ache. Your shoulder goes numb. You shift position, which helps briefly, then the new pressure points start hurting. The thin layer of wool cloaks provides almost no cushioning. You find yourself missing the compressed straw mattress, which at least had some give to it. The bakehouse also has sounds and smells that the sleeping chamber doesn't. The ovens tick and crack as they cool metal and brick, expanding and contracting, creating sharp noises that startle you out of near sleep. The smell is intensely floury. You've become noseblind to it during the day, but at night, lying still, you notice it again. Wheat dust, rye dust, the yeasty smell of fermenting dough, the charred smell of burnt flour that never entirely leaves the oven bricks. It's not unpleasant exactly, but it's strong and omnipresent. There are also rats. You hear them constantly in the walls and ceiling timbers, scratching, squeaking, scurrying. During the day, the noise and activity of baking keeps them hidden. At night, they emerge, searching for spilled flour bits of dough, anything edible. They're bold. You've had rats run across your legs while you're lying in the bakehouse, their tiny feet creating a horrible tickling sensation through the wool. The cat would be useful here, but she's still in the sleeping chamber and shows no interest in following you to the bakehouse. Historians still argue whether medieval people were more tolerant of rats or simply had no effective way to eliminate them, but you know it's the latter. You hate rats. They contaminate flour, they gnaw through storage sacks, they carry disease. But you also can't eliminate them. For every one you kill, 2 more appear. The castle's cats make a dent in the population, but rats reproduce faster than cats can hunt, so you coexist uneasily, trying to minimize their access to food stores while accepting that complete eradication is impossible. Despite the discomforts, hard floor rat sounds the peculiar vulnerability of sleeping in a workspace you do eventually sleep. The warmth from the ovens is too valuable, the exhaustion too profound. Your body surrenders to unconsciousness even in these imperfect conditions. It's not deep sleep, not restorative in any real sense, but it's enough. You survive the night. That's the only metric that matters. Morning comes even earlier when you sleep in the bakehouse because you're already at your workplace. No transition period, no warming up by the ovens before starting work. You simply wake around 3 a.m. as always and immediately begin the day's tasks. The ovens need revival, coals need raking, new wood needs adding, the fire needs building. You move stiffly, your body protesting the night on stone, but you move nonetheless because work waits for no one. Thomas and Peter wake in sequence, each responding to the sounds of your activity. Peter rolls up the blankets and cloaks, carrying them back to the sleeping chamber. Thomas helps you with the ovens, his young muscles better suited for the heavy work of lifting wood and hauling supplies. Within 30 minutes, you've transitioned from exhausted survivors on a cold floor to functioning bakers starting the day's production. You'll pay for the bakehouse sleep throughout the day. Your back will ache from the hard floor. Your hip will remind you of its complaints with every step. You'll be more tired than usual because the sleep was shallow and broken, but you're alive. You survived a night that might have killed you if you'd stayed in the sleeping chamber. The bakehouse saved you the oven's residual heat, providing just enough warmth to keep your body functioning. This emergency protocol happens often enough that you've almost gotten used to it. When you feel the first signs of dangerous cold in the sleeping chamber, you don't hesitate anymore. You move to the bakehouse, accept the discomfort, and survive. It's become part of the winter routine, another adaptation in the endless series of adaptations that medieval survival requires. The bakehouse isn't just your workplace, it's your backup shelter, your emergency refuge, your last line of defense against the killing cold. And as you knead the first batch of dough, your hands still stiff from cold despite the oven's growing heat, you think about how the bakehouse has become more than just a room. It's your entire world where you work, where you eat sometimes, where you sleep on desperate nights, where you'll probably die eventually. The ovens are your life support system, their heat and your skill, the only thing standing between you and the indifferent winter waiting just beyond the stone walls. The nobles sleep differently, and you know this even though you've never set foot in their private chambers. You've caught glimpses, a doorway briefly open when delivering bread to the great hall, conversations overheard among servants who clean those upper rooms, the evidence of luxury that occasionally filters down through the castle's rigid social hierarchy. And what you've learned creates a strange mixture of envy, resentment, and occasional unexpected relief that you're not them. The lord and lady sleep in a massive curtained bed on the upper floor of the main tower. This bed is legendary among the servants. It's described in whispered tones as a fortress of warmth, a sanctuary from winter. The frame is carved oak, imported from somewhere distant and expensive. The mattress isn't straw, but feathers, actual goose down, collected and stitched into linen casings, creating a surface that's supposedly like sleeping on clouds. The sheets are linen, bleached white through laborious processing, changed weekly by servants. On top there are furs, wolf pelts, bearskins, even ermine for the lady's side, layered so thickly that the occupants can barely move under their weight. The bed itself has curtains, heavy wool tapestries that hang from a wooden framework, creating a tent-like enclosure around the sleeping area. These curtains serve multiple functions. They provide privacy, they block drafts, and most importantly, they trap body heat and create a microclimate within the bed tent that's significantly warmer than the chamber itself. Servants describe entering this curtained space to wake the lord and feeling a wall of warm, humid air thick with the smell of sleeping humans and the musk of fur. But here's what the nobles don't have: proximity to heat sources. Their tower chamber is defensible, secure, prestigious, and far from any kitchen or bakehouse. There might be a small brazier burning charcoal tended by a servant, but it's nothing like sleeping 2 feet from a brick oven. The stone walls of the tower are just as cold as your walls, maybe colder, because they're higher and more exposed to wind. The windows are larger, covered with expensive glass or oiled cloth, but still sources of drafts. So despite all their luxury materials, the nobles are fighting the same fundamental battle you're keeping warm enough to survive the night. They just fight it with different weapons. You have communal body heat, oven proximity, and wool. They have feathers, furs, and curtained isolation. Which strategy actually works better is debatable. You suspect you might actually sleep warmer than the lord, though infinitely less comfortably. There's also the question of privacy. The lord and lady sleep alone in their enormous bed, no Thomas, radiating heat in the middle, no Peter's breathing nearby, no cats wandering across the bedding. Just 2 bodies separated by expensive fabrics and social convention. You've heard that noble marriages are often cold in multiple senses, that husband and wife might maintain separate sleeping areas within the same curtained bed, dividing territory with pillows and furs. This strikes you as insane. Why would you voluntarily give up the warmth of another human body? But nobility comes with different rules. They have concepts like modesty and propriety that require physical separation even between married people. They can't sleep in piles like you Thomas and Peter do. They can't press together for warmth without it being interpreted as sexual or improper. Their social conventions literally make them colder, forcing them to compensate with material goods, more furs, more feathers, more curtains. The nobles also have the bizarre luxury of changing clothes before bed. They own separate sleeping garments, special linen gowns designed purely for bed use. This seems wasteful to you. I own clothes that serve only one purpose, but apparently it's a status marker. The lord removes his day clothes, hands them to a servant, and dons a sleeping gown. The lady has an even more elaborate routine involving multiple attendants. All this changing generates heat loss. They're standing around naked or partially clothed in a cold chamber for several minutes, losing body warmth that they then have to regenerate under their furs. You, by contrast, never remove your clothes. You just add layers. Your body stays warm continuously from evening through morning. The nobles' bathing and changing routine seems actively counterproductive to survival, but it's required by their status. They must maintain certain standards of cleanliness and propriety, even at the cost of comfort and warmth. There's also the matter of servants. A noble doesn't have to get up to check on anything during the night. If they need water, a servant fetches it. If they need the chamber pot, a servant holds it. If the brazier needs more charcoal, a servant adds it. This sounds luxurious until you think about it more carefully. It means there are servants sleeping in the noble's chamber, or just outside it available for midnight summons. These servants, often young pages or chambermaids, sleep on the floor with minimal bedding colder than you've ever been ready to wake instantly when called. So the noble's warmth is partially built on the servant's suffering. The chambermaid who tends the lady's fire sleeps on cold stone with a single thin blanket, her body heat sacrificed so the lady can stay comfortable. The page who sleeps outside the lord's chamber ready to run midnight errands is probably colder than Peter, in the worst sleeping position. The hierarchy of warmth extends all the way up. Everyone is using someone else's labour or suffering to improve their own position. Historians still argue whether medieval nobles actually enjoyed their lifestyles or whether they were trapped by their own elaborate protocols, but from your perspective, nobility looks like a mixed blessing. Yes, they have feather mattresses and furs, but they also have isolation propriety constraints and the burden of maintaining elaborate routines, even when simple solutions would work better. You wouldn't trade positions with the lord if offered. Your pile of humans on straw near an oven is warmer, more efficient, and doesn't require exploiting servants who sleep on cold floors. There's one aspect of noble sleeping arrangements that does inspire genuine envy: their immunity to certain consequences. If a noble gets sick from cold exposure, physicians attend them. Expensive medicines are procured. Recovery time is unlimited. If you get sick, you work through it or risk losing your position. If the cold permanently damages a noble's hands, they don't need to knead dough anymore. Servants do that. Your damaged hands end your career and possibly your life. But then you remember nobles die young too. Childbirth kills noble women just as readily as peasant women. Infection doesn't care about status. A cut on a noble's hand can fester and kill just as easily as a cut on yours. The lord's father died at 43, they say, from some wasting illness that all the physicians and medicines couldn't cure. Your predecessor made it to 52. Comfort and wealth don't guarantee survival. They just change the variables in the equation. You've also heard stories about nobles who can't sleep in their elaborate beds, who suffer from some anxiety or discomfort that all the feathers and furs can't cure. Insomnia plagues the rich and poor alike. At least your exhaustion guarantees sleep. You're so physically tired that consciousness simply shuts down. The lord whose day involves primarily sitting and making decisions might lie awake for hours despite his comfortable bedding, his mind churning through political problems and social obligations. So you've arrived at a kind of peace with the sleeping hierarchy. The nobles have their tower chambers and feather beds. You have your stone cavity and straw mattress. Both of you are fighting winter. Both of you are trying to survive until spring. The methods differ, but the fundamental struggle is the same. And honestly pressed between Thomas's warm bulk and the radiant brick of the oven wall, you wouldn't trade your position for anything the nobles have. Well, maybe you'd take the furs. The furs would be nice. But everything else, you'll keep what you have. And now, as the fire in those ovens has banked down to glowing embers, as Thomas's breathing has settled into the deep rhythm of genuine sleep, as Peter's shivers have finally subsided into stillness, as the cat purrs softly against your chest, and the wool blanket holds back just enough cold to make survival possible, as all these elements align in their familiar pattern, this story reaches its natural end. You've walked through every hour of a baker's night, felt the cold seep through stone, understood the calculations that determine who sleeps where, experienced the fear of fire and the gratitude for warmth, witnessed the rituals and remedies and desperate innovations that medieval people employed to survive what should have killed them. The bakers who lived these nights have been gone for 700 years. Their names are forgotten, their individual struggles unrecorded, their voices silenced by time. But the shape of their survival remains in the placement of ovens near sleeping chambers, in the folk wisdom about layered wool and communal warmth, in the very structure of medieval buildings that were designed, however imperfectly, to help human beings endure the brutal winters that defined their world. And perhaps in some small way, by spending these hours inhabiting their experience, by feeling what they felt and understanding what they understood, we've brought them briefly back to life. Not as historical abstractions or medieval stereotypes, but as real people who got cold and tired and scared, who developed solutions that mostly worked, who loved warmth and feared fire and treasured the small comforts that made life bearable. The castle is sleeping now. The ovens are silent. The cold presses against every surface. And somewhere in that darkness, wrapped in wool, and sustained by community and warmed by the memory of fire, the bakers rest as best they can, knowing that tomorrow will demand everything they have and somehow they'll find a way to give it. The story ends here. See you in the next video. Good night. Mosquitoes are the worst. They emerge in clouds from any standing water. The moat, the fish ponds, even puddles in the courtyard, and they're relentless. You can hear them whining near your ears, feel them landing on any exposed skin, the sharp sting of bites. You try wrapping your head in cloth, but that makes breathing difficult and the heat worse. You try smoke small. Smudge fires are common in the courtyard, people burning green wood or specific herbs believed to repel insects, but smoke also makes breathing difficult and your eyes water. Fleas and bedbugs are also more active in summer. They breed prolifically in the warm conditions, hiding in fabric creases, and bedding emerging at night to feed. You wake up covered in small red welts, itching intensely, sometimes drawing blood from scratching in your sleep. There's no effective solution. Various folk remedies exist, washing with certain herbs, sprinkling crushed flowers around your bedding prayers to specific saints, but none of them work consistently. The lack of the oven wall's warmth means you lose that familiar anchor point. All winter you've oriented yourself relative to that warm stone surface. Now, sleeping on bare ground or flagstone in the courtyard, you have no thermal reference point. The ground is warmer than stone in winter, but not warm enough to be comfortable. You still use some bedding, you can't sleep directly on dirt, but the straw mattresses are thinner in summer, because thick bedding traps too much heat. Rain is another complication. Summer storms arrive suddenly, sometimes at night. You might fall asleep under clear skies and wake to raindrops hitting your face, scrambling to gather your bedding and find shelter before everything gets soaked. The covered arcades provide some protection, but they're crowded and the rain often blows in sideways. Sometimes you just get wet. Wet wool takes days to dry completely, and sleeping in damp wool is miserable. Even in summer it chafes, smells worse, and increases the risk of skin infections. Security is also different outdoors. In the sleeping chamber you know exactly who's nearby. Thomas and Peter always the same people. Outdoors the population shifts nightly. There are strangers, transients, people you don't know or trust. Theft is a greater risk. You sleep with your few possessions close to your body, your good knife tucked under your makeshift pillow, your spare hose wadded up where you can feel them. You're less worried about violent crime. The castle has guards and serious violence would be punished harshly, but opportunistic theft is always possible. Historians still argue whether medieval people actually slept outdoors as commonly as records suggest, but you know the truth, everyone does it in summer, because the alternative is cooking to death in stone rooms. The nobility might have better options, their tower chambers catch breezes that lower rooms don't, and they can afford thin linen sheets instead of wool, but even nobles sometimes retreat to gardens or rooftops when heat becomes unbearable. Thomas handles summer better than you or Peter. His young body regulates temperature more efficiently, and he seems genuinely unbothered by heat that leaves you exhausted and irritable. He sleeps sprawled on his back in the courtyard, barely covered, apparently comfortable. Peter suffers differently than in winter, but equally intensely he gets more mosquito bites. His thin frame offers no cushioning against hard ground, and the lack of structure makes him anxious. He needs the routine and enclosure of the sleeping chamber, and summer's chaos unsettles him. You find yourself missing winter, which is absurd when you're shivering in February, but makes perfect sense in July. At least winter's problems are straightforward. Stay warm, avoid frostbite, survive until morning. Summer's problems are multiple and intersecting: heat exhaustion, dehydration, insect bites, potential infections from those bites, skin rashes from sweat and friction, stomach troubles from food that spoils faster in warm conditions, and the constant low-level stress of sleeping in exposed, crowded, unpredictable conditions. The bakehouse work is also more brutal in summer. The ovens must still roar at the same temperatures. Bread doesn't care about the season, but now you're working in 90-degree ambient heat, plus the oven's radiant heat. The temperature near the oven faces probably exceeds 120 degrees. You sweat constantly, losing fluid faster than you can replace it. The salt loss makes you dizzy. Your hands shake. Several times each summer you or Thomas or Peter will come close to passing out from heat. Exhaustion, stumbling away from the ovens to sit in the coolest corner available drinking water and trying to recover enough to continue working. Dehydration affects sleep quality. You wake multiple times desperate for water, your mouth dry, your head pounding. But drinking a lot of water before sleep guarantees multiple trips to piss during the night, which outdoors means navigating through sleeping bodies to reach the latrines. There's no good solution, just a choice between competing discomforts. Food is both easier and harder in summer. Fresh vegetables appear things you haven't seen in months, and they're wonderful. But food also spoils quickly. That pottage that would last 3 days in winter turns sour overnight in summer. You've had food poisoning, the vomiting and diarrhea that comes from eating something that's gone bad, and it's one of the most miserable experiences imaginable. You've learned to be cautious with summer food, but sometimes there's no choice but to eat what's available and hope your stomach handles it. The compensation for all this summer suffering is that survival feels less precarious. You're not going to freeze to death. That fundamental winter fear that you might simply not wake up because the cold finally won and your body gave up doesn't exist in summer. You might be miserable, bitten, exhausted, uncomfortable, but you're not in immediate danger of dying from exposure. That's a significant psychological difference. You also eat better in summer. More variety, fresh foods, occasional fruits. Your body recovers from winter's deprivations. The weight you lost comes back. Your energy levels improve. The damaged skin on your hands and feet heals somewhat. By August, you're probably in the best physical condition you'll experience all year, even though you're sleeping poorly and working in hellish heat. And despite everything, there are moments of summer beauty that don't exist in winter. Sleeping outside means you can see stars on clear nights, thousands of them, the Milky Way, a river of light across the sky. You don't understand astronomy, but you recognize patterns and use them to judge time. The constellations accompany familiar friends in the darkness. Sometimes the moon is bright enough to cast shadows, and the courtyard becomes a silvery landscape that's almost magical. You can also hear summer's sounds, nightingales singing, which is supposedly romantic, though mostly it just keeps you awake. Crickets chirping in rhythmic waves, the rustle of leaves in trees. In winter everything is silent except the wind and suffering. Summer has a soundtrack, and while it's not always pleasant, it's at least varied and alive. So you endure summer the same way you endure winter, through adaptation, acceptance, and the knowledge that this too will pass. By September the heat will break. By October you'll be grateful for warm afternoons. By November you'll be scrambling back to the sleeping chamber, stuffing fresh straw into mattress sacks, checking the oven walls, preparing for another cycle of cold survival. The wheel turns, the seasons change, and you remain adapting, surviving, sleeping wherever and however you can. Illness changes everything about sleeping arrangements, and not in the compassionate ways you might hope. When someone gets sick in your sleeping chamber, and someone always gets sick multiple times each winter, the response isn't tender nursing care, it's a cold calculation. Is this person sick enough that keeping them close risks everyone's survival? And if so, where do you put them that maximizes their recovery chances while minimizing contagion? Peter gets sick most often because he's youngest, and his body hasn't built up the resistances that you and Thomas have accumulated through years of exposure. The first sign is usually a cough, not the dry throat clearing everyone does from breathing flour dust, but a deep wet cough that produces phlegm. Then comes fever. You can feel it radiating from his body before he even admits feeling unwell, his skin hot to the touch through the wool, his breathing rapid and shallow. The protocol is well established because it's happened before. Peter must be moved closer to the primary heat source. That means your position against the oven wall. This sounds generous, but it's actually pragmatic. A sick person needs warmth to fight off illness, needs to sweat out the fever, needs their body temperature elevated to kill whatever infection has taken hold. Medieval medicine doesn't understand bacteria or viruses, but it understands empirically that keeping sick people warm improves survival rates. So you surrender your sleeping position to Peter, and you take his spot near the door, the coldest position, the one you worked years to escape. This isn't sacrifice, it's self-preservation. A baker who can't work is worthless. Peter needs to recover quickly so the bakehouse can function. The Lord's bread doesn't stop needing to be baked just because an apprentice is sick. If Peter can't knead or carry or tend the ovens, you and Thomas have to work harder, which makes you more susceptible to illness, which could cascade into total bakehouse failure. Thomas moves to the middle position, the one Peter vacated, and continues serving as the primary heat source. But now he's pressed against a feverish, coughing, possibly contagious body, instead of just a cold, healthy one. The risk to Thomas is significant. If he catches whatever Peter has, you lose both apprentices simultaneously, and the bakehouse operation becomes nearly impossible. But there's no alternative. Peter needs body heat, and Thomas generates the most. The sick person gets additional resources grudgingly allocated. The kitchen sends up extra broth-thin soup made from bones and scraps not nutritious enough to sustain heavy labour, but better than nothing. Peter gets more ale rations, the liquid calories helping maintain his strength. Sometimes the castle's healer visits, though his treatments are a mixture of useful and useless. He might recommend keeping Peter warm, helpful bloodletting to balance humours, probably actively harmful, or prayers to St. Sebastian, harmless but ineffective. Folk remedies flood in from well-meaning castle inhabitants. Someone suggests a poultice of mustard seed and honey applied to Peter's chest. Someone else recommends garlic cloves inserted in his ears. Another person swears by inhaling the steam from boiled sage and thyme. You try some of these, the steam inhalation seems to ease Peter's coughing, and the garlic couldn't hurt even if it probably doesn't help. But mostly you just keep him warm, and hope his young body fights off whatever has infected him. The nights when Peter is sick are deeply uncomfortable for everyone. His coughing wakes you, repeatedly wet-racking coughs that shake his whole body and splatter phlegm onto the shared bedding. He moans in his sleep semi-conscious mutterings that might be prayers or just fever dreams. His body alternates between burning hot and shivering cold as the fever spikes and breaks, requiring constant adjustment of blankets and position. You also worry, though, you'd never admit it aloud that Peter might die. People die from chest infections all the time, especially young people whose bodies lack the resilience to fight off serious illness. You've seen it before, a seemingly minor cough that develops into something worse, the breathing becoming laboured, the fever refusing to break, and then one morning the person simply doesn't wake up. If Peter dies, you'll need to find and train a new apprentice, which is expensive and time-consuming, and disrupts the bakehouse operation for months. But there's also a selfish fear beneath the practical concerns. If Peter dies in your sleeping space, there will be rituals and superstitions to observe. The body must be removed, promptly blessed, washed. The bedding must be burned or at minimum thoroughly cleaned, which means losing your straw mattress and sheepskins. The chamber itself might need blessing to prevent Peter's spirit from lingering. All of this is disruptive and unpleasant, and while you'd mourn Peter, he's been your apprentice for 2 years, you know his habits and quirks, you'd mourn the practical disruptions almost as much as the human loss. Historians still argue whether medieval people actually cared less about individual human lives, or whether they just expressed grief differently, but the truth is complicated. You care about Peter. But you also can't afford to care too much. Attachment to people who might die at any moment is emotionally dangerous. Better to maintain some distance, to think of apprentices as semi-replaceable labour units who contribute to bakehouse function. It sounds callous when articulated clearly, but it's psychologically necessary. Thomas seems more emotionally affected by Peter's illness. They're closer in age, and Thomas has been teaching Peter specific techniques, creating a mentorship bond that's different from your more distant master-apprentice relationship. You hear Thomas whispering to Peter in the darkness, reassuring him, telling him he'll recover, promising that the fever will break soon. It's tender in a way that makes you slightly uncomfortable, not because tenderness is wrong, but because it represents vulnerability that survival discourages. On the 3rd or 4th night of serious illness, Peter's fever finally breaks. You wake during your midnight period and realize he feels cooler, his breathing easier, the desperate heat that radiated from his body diminished. He's sleeping more peacefully, no longer coughing every few minutes. Relief floods through you, not just for Peter's sake, but for everyone's. The crisis is passing. The bakehouse won't lose an apprentice. Thomas won't get sick. You can return to your normal sleeping position soon. Peter's recovery takes another week of reduced work and continued warmth, but he gradually regains strength. His appetite returns. His coughing becomes occasional rather than constant. The colour returns to his face, and eventually the sleeping arrangement resets to normal. You reclaim your position against the oven wall. Thomas returns to the middle. Peter takes back his cold spot near the door. The hierarchy reasserts itself, the temporary disruption resolved. But Peter isn't quite the same after the illness. He's thinner, more fragile looking, his endurance reduced. It'll take months for him to fully rebuild his strength. He's also more cautious, more aware of his vulnerability. He wears extra layers. He drinks more warm ale. He stays closer to the ovens. The illness taught him something about mortality that no amount of verbal instruction could convey. He came close to dying, close enough to feel death's presence in the fever and delirium, and that knowledge changes how you approach survival. You went through something similar when you were an apprentice, a chest infection that nearly killed you, weeks of struggle, before your body finally fought it off. The experience left scars, literal and psychological, that never fully healed. You suspect Peter now carries similar scars, invisible marks, that will shape how he approaches winter survival for the rest of his life, however long that might be. The castle's healer, when Peter has recovered enough, delivers his prognosis. The humours were unbalanced, cold and wet predominated, but warmth and dryness have restored equilibrium. You don't understand the theory. Humoral medicine is mostly nonsense, but you understand the implication Peter survived because you kept him warm. The sleeping arrangement, the position against the oven wall, the communal body heat, these were the actual medicine more effective than any poultice or prayer. The healer gets credit, but you know the truth. Warmth saved Peter's life. The same warmth that barely keeps you alive every winter, that you struggle constantly to maintain, that requires such careful management and such painful hierarchy, that warmth is also healing, life-preserving, the difference between survival and death. And that knowledge reinforces something you've always known, but rarely articulate. Your entire existence revolves around heat. Heat to bake bread. Heat to survive sleep. Heat to recover from illness. Heat is life, and cold is death, and everything you do, every decision about sleeping position, every calculation about bedding and blankets, every midnight adjustment and morning routine is fundamentally about capturing and holding on to enough heat to see another day. Fire is sacred and fire is dangerous, and you live perpetually balanced between worship and terror. Every night as you bank the ovens for sleep, you're performing a ritual that's part practical necessity and part prayer, asking the fire to stay controlled, to not escape its brick prison, to not consume the castle while everyone sleeps. Because fire is the thing that could kill everyone faster than cold ever could, and you're responsible for managing the largest, hottest, most dangerous flames in the entire structure. The paranoia never leaves, even after you've checked the ovens 3 times, even after you've sealed the doors and distributed the coals evenly, even after you've swept every corner of the bakehouse for stray sparks or smouldering flour dust, even after you've finally settled into the bedding and started drifting towards sleep, the paranoia remains. Part of your consciousness stays alert, listening, always listening. For the specific sound that would mean disaster, the crackle of fire where fire shouldn't be the smell of smoke that's wrong somehow, different from the usual omnipresent bakehouse smoke. You've heard the stories. Every castle has them passed down through generations of servants. The castle 30 miles north that burned completely one winter night because a spark from the kitchen hearth found its way into stored grain. 40 people dead, including the lord's family, the structure reduced to blackened stone walls, or the monastery bakehouse where an exhausted baker fell asleep too close to the ovens, and his wool cloak caught fire and he burned to death before anyone could help him, or the granary fire that started from spontaneous combustion in damp grain spreading so fast that it consumed 6 months of food stores in less than an hour. These stories aren't told to entertain. They're told as warnings, as reminders of what happens when vigilance fails. Fire doesn't forgive mistakes. Fire doesn't care about your exhaustion or your good intentions. Fire is always waiting for the opportunity to escape control, and your job is to never give it that opportunity. So your sleep is never truly deep, never fully relaxed. Some part of your brain stays on watch processing sounds even while you're unconscious. Thomas and Peter don't carry this burden the same way their apprentices, not ultimately responsible though they're learning. Thomas is beginning to show the same unconscious vigilance the way he'll startle awake at an unusual sound and immediately ask the ovens. Peter is still too young to have fully internalized the fear, but he will. Everyone does eventually, or they don't last long as bakers. The midnight wakeful period becomes a fire inspection round as much as anything else. During that hour when you're naturally awake, you often rise and walk through the bakehouse in the darkness, checking by touch and smell more than sight. You press your hands against the oven exteriors, feeling for hot spots that shouldn't exist. You sniff the air for the acrid smell of something burning that shouldn't be burning. You check the chimney areas for sparks or embers that might have escaped upward. You examine the wooden beams that support the bakehouse roof, making sure none of them are charring from proximity to heat. This inspection is physical, but it's also spiritual. You're not religious in the formal sense you attend Mass when required, but don't think deeply about theological questions, yet your relationship with fire has religious dimensions. Fire is a living thing demanding respect and offerings and constant attention. In exchange, it provides warmth and the ability to transform flour into bread. It's a covenant unspoken but deeply felt. You serve the fire, and the fire serves you, and neither of you betrays the other. Sometimes you whisper to the fire during these midnight inspections. Not prayers exactly, more like conversations or negotiations. Stay calm tonight. Stay in your place. I'll feed you well tomorrow. It sounds insane when you think about it rationally, but rationality has limited application when you're alone in the darkness with the thing that could kill everyone. The fire seems to respond to attention, to respect, or maybe that's just psychological projection. Either way, the ritual brings comfort. The castle has attempted fire prevention measures with varying success. There are leather buckets stationed at intervals supposedly kept filled with water for emergency use. In practice, the water often freezes in winter or gets used for other purposes, rendering the buckets useless. There are also long-handled hooks meant for pulling burning thatch from roofs, though the bakehouse has stone vaulting, not thatch. The chapel contains a relic of St. Florian, patron saint of firefighters, though whether a bone fragment in a silver box provides actual protection against fire is questionable. Historians still argue whether medieval buildings burned as frequently as records suggest, or whether fires were just more memorable and therefore over-recorded, but, fires are common enough to be a constant concern. Every castle has burn scars sections of wall, blackened by old fires, rebuilt areas where flames once consumed wooden structures, stories of narrow escapes and not-so-narrow tragedies. The worst part is that fire in winter when you need it most, for survival, is also most dangerous. The castle is full of flammable materials, wooden beams, wool fabric, straw bedding, stored grain. Everything is dry from the cold and from being kept near heat sources. A single spark in the wrong place could ignite a catastrophic blaze that would spread faster than people could evacuate. You'd all die not from burning necessarily, but from smoke inhalation, or from being trampled in the panic, or from jumping from high windows to escape flames. You've had nightmares about this. Dreams where you wake to find the bakehouse engulfed flames roaring up the walls, the heat so intense you can't approach the exit. Dreams where you're trapped behind a wall of fire, screaming for help that doesn't come. Dreams where you watch Thomas or Peter burning their bodies, writhing in flames, their screams cutting through the roar of the fire. You wake from these nightmares gasping immediately, checking the darkness for the smell of smoke, taking several minutes to calm down enough to sleep again. Thomas has similar nightmares. He's mentioned them briefly in the cautious way men discuss fears they're not supposed to have. Peter probably has them too, but hasn't admitted it. The nightmares are part of the job's psychological scars from living in intimate proximity with controlled disaster. You don't talk about them much because talking might make them more real, might somehow invite the disaster you're all trying to prevent. There are also superstitions about fire that everyone observes even if they're not sure they believe them. Never let a fire die completely, always maintain coals, always keep some flame alive because a completely dead fire is bad luck, and might anger whatever spirits inhabit flames. Never spit into fire, it's disrespectful, and might cause the fire to spit back with dangerous sparks. Never burn certain woods that are considered cursed or unlucky, always make the sign of the cross when lighting a new fire. These superstitions are probably baseless, but they're also harmless, and following them provides psychological comfort. The fire also connects you to something larger than yourself. Every hearth and oven in the castle contains flames descended from the same original source fire that's been continuously maintained, passed from flame to flame, never allowed to die completely. This fire has burned for generations, tended by dozens of bakers before you, and will presumably burn for generations after. You're just one keeper in a long chain temporary guardian of an eternal flame, oven. There's something humbling and meaningful about that continuity. When you watch the coals glowing in the darkness during your midnight wakeful period, you sometimes think about all the other bakers throughout history who've done the same thing, sat alone with fire, felt the same mixture of gratitude and fear, carried the same responsibility. The fire connects you across time to every human who's ever tried to survive winter. Everyone who's balanced on the knife edge between freezing and burning, everyone who's understood that heat is both salvation and threat. The fire is also democratic in a way few other things in medieval life are. The Lord's fire doesn't burn hotter than yours. Flames don't care about social rank. A spark that escapes control in the noble's chamber is just as dangerous as a spark in the bakehouse. Maybe more dangerous because nobles are less practiced at managing fire, more likely to make mistakes. In the realm of fire, you're actually more competent and knowledgeable than the people who outrank you socially. Your expertise matters. Your vigilance protects everyone, noble and peasant alike. So you carry the burden night after night, year after year. The hyper-vigilance, the nightmares, the midnight inspections, the whispered conversations with flames, the prayer that you'll wake up to another dawn rather than disaster. It's exhausting, this constant watchfulness, but it's also the price of warmth. You can't have the life-giving heat without accepting the potential for destruction. That's the bargain. And so far, after years of tending these ovens, you've kept your end of the deal. The fire stays controlled. The castle doesn't burn. Everyone survives to face another cold night. And tomorrow you'll do it all again, because that's what survival requires: eternal vigilance against the thing you need most. The line between medicine and magic blurs completely when you're desperate and cold and willing to try anything that might help. You know intellectually that rubbing garlic on your feet won't cure frostbite through any mechanism you understand. But you also know that people have been rubbing garlic on their feet for generations, and some of them survived, and maybe there's something to it, even if the explanation involves humours and sympathetic magic, rather than anything that makes rational sense. So you do it. Before sleeping on the coldest nights, you take a clove of garlic, precious rationed, normally reserved for cooking, and crush it slightly to release the oils. Then you rub it on the soles of your feet, between your toes, around your ankles. The smell is overwhelming, sharp and acrid, and it burns slightly on damaged skin. But the burning feels like something happening, like active treatment rather than passive suffering. And when you pull on your hose and settle into the bedding, you can smell the garlic strongly. And somehow that smell becomes associated with survival, with fighting back against the cold. Does it work? Impossible to say. Garlic does have mild antimicrobial properties. You don't know this in chemical terms, but you know empirically that garlic seems to help wounds heal faster, seems to prevent certain infections. Maybe rubbing it on your feet protects against the infections that often develop in cold damaged tissue. Maybe it does nothing, and you're just engaging in theatrical placebo, but the distinction doesn't matter when survival is at stake. If the ritual makes you feel more in control, more protected, more likely to survive, then it's valuable regardless of mechanism. There's also the rosemary under your pillow, or rather under the wadded-up cloth that serves as your pillow. A sprig of dried rosemary acquired from the castle's herb garden, tucked into the makeshift pillow where its scent can reach your nose as you sleep. Rosemary is supposed to promote good dreams, protect against evil spirits, improve sleep quality, strengthen memory, and ward off illness. Whether any of this is true doesn't matter. The scent is pleasant, vaguely medicinal, and distinctly different from the usual smell of smoke and sweat and wool. That difference alone makes it valuable, a small sensory pleasure in an environment mostly devoid of pleasant smells. Peter keeps a small leather pouch around his neck, worn under his tunic where it rests against his chest. Inside the pouch, a pebble from his home village, a dried flower his mother gave him, and supposedly a saint's relic, though you suspect it's just a bone fragment from some animal. He believes it protects him, and who are you to argue? If the pouch provides psychological comfort, if it helps him sleep, if it makes him feel less alone and vulnerable in the cold darkness, then it's serving a real function, regardless of whether the relic is authentic or the magic is real. Thomas has his own practices. He makes the sign of the cross before lying down every single night without fail, and whispers a brief prayer you can't quite hear. He also keeps a small iron nail tucked into his hose. Iron is supposed to ward off evil spirits and bad luck, and a nail blessed by the priest is particularly powerful. You've noticed he touches the nail sometimes when he's anxious, or having trouble sleeping, his fingers finding it through the fabric, the small ritual bringing apparent calm. You have your own collection of protective items and rituals accumulated over years. The horseshoe above the door, which you've already checked during your midnight wakeful period. A dried bundle of wormwood hanging from a beam. Wormwood is supposed to repel insects and evil influences, and while you're skeptical about the evil influences, you're willing to believe it might discourage some insects. A small wooden cross crudely carved that you keep tucked into your tunic. Not because you're especially devout, but because having it there feels like insurance, like one more layer of protection against the many dangers that threaten you nightly. The castle's healer, when consulted about winter survival, provides advice that mixes legitimate medical knowledge with complete superstition in proportions you can't untangle. He recommends keeping your head covered, sensible drinking warm liquids, sensible bloodletting to balance excess phlegm, probably harmful, consuming heating foods like ginger and pepper, possibly helpful through metabolic effects, avoiding cold and wet foods that increase phlegmatic humours, probably irrelevant, reciting specific prayers before sleep, harmless but useless, and wearing red fabric which resists cold better than other colours, completely baseless. You follow some of his advice and ignore the rest, making your own assessments about what seems to work. The warm liquids definitely help. The prayers probably don't hurt. The bloodletting you avoid because you've seen too many people weakened by it, their bodies struggling to recover from the blood loss on top of everything else. The red fabric thing you ignore entirely. You'll wear whatever wool is available regardless of colour. Historians still argue whether medieval people actually believed in the medical theories they followed, or whether they just didn't have alternatives, but you know the answer is complicated. You don't fully believe in the four humours theory. It's never quite made sense to you how your body could contain discrete quantities of blood phlegm, black bile and yellow bile that need balancing. But you also don't have a better explanation for why people get sick, or how bodies work. So you entertain the theory, loosely following its recommendations when they seem reasonable, and ignoring them when they don't. The folk remedies are even more varied and contradictory. Different people swear by different treatments. One servant insists that drinking your own urine cures frostbite. You've never tried this, and hope you never get desperate enough to. Another person claims that wrapping your feet in fresh sheep's wool still warm from shearing prevents cold damage. This one you'd try if fresh sheep's wool were available in winter, which it's not. Someone else recommends sleeping with a hot stone wrapped in cloth held against your stomach to warm your core. You've tried this, occasionally heating a stone near the oven before bed, and it does provide temporary warmth, though it cools quickly. The accumulation of these practices creates a bedtime routine that's part hygiene, part superstition, part folk medicine, and part prayer. You check your body for injuries or problems. You rub garlic on your feet if you have garlic to spare. You position the rosemary under your pillow. You touch your protective iron horseshoe. You make a brief prayer not to any specific saint, but just a general plea for survival. Let me wake in the morning, keep the fire controlled, protect Thomas and Peter, get us all through to spring. Then you settle into the bedding, arranging your wool layers, pressing close to Thomas, pulling the blanket over yourself, and waiting for sleep to come. These rituals probably don't affect your physical survival in any direct way. The garlic and rosemary and prayers aren't creating measurable changes in temperature or preventing frostbite through supernatural intervention. But they affect your psychological state, your sense of control, your ability to relax enough to sleep despite the cold and danger. And psychological state matters enormously for survival. People who give up, who succumb to despair, who lose the will to keep fighting, they die faster than people who maintain hope and purpose. So if the rituals support your psychological resilience, they're contributing to survival, even if the mechanism is entirely mental. There's also something comforting about participating in practices that connect you to the broader community. Everyone has their garlic, their rosemary, their protective amulets, their bedtime prayers. These shared practices create a sense of solidarity. You're all fighting the same battle using the same weapons, even if those weapons are partly or mostly symbolic. The castle becomes a collective of people performing their individual rituals, creating a web of protective magic or positive thinking, or placebo effect that somehow holds back the darkness and cold. And maybe there's something real underneath all the superstition. Not magic in the supernatural sense, but accumulated wisdom encoded in ritual. The garlic might actually help prevent infection through antimicrobial compounds. The rosemary might actually affect brain chemistry through aromatic compounds promoting relaxation and better sleep. The prayers might activate stress reduction mechanisms through meditation-like effects. The protective amulets might provide a focus for mindfulness, keeping you present and aware rather than spiraling into anxiety. You'll never know for certain what works and what doesn't. You can't run controlled experiments. You can't isolate variables. You just do everything you can think of, everything that tradition suggests, everything that gives you even a sliver of hope. And then you trust that some combination of those efforts, plus luck, plus your body's resilience will carry you through another night. It's not scientific. It's not elegant, but it's what you have, and somehow, season after season, it's enough. The rituals continue, the magic or medicine or placebo does its work, and morning arrives with you still alive, still functional, ready to face another day of survival. And now, as the fire in those ovens has banked down to glowing embers, as Thomas's breathing has settled into the deep rhythm of genuine sleep, as Peter's shivers have finally subsided into stillness, as the cat purrs softly against your chest, and the wool blanket holds back just enough cold to make survival possible, as all these elements align in their familiar pattern, this story reaches its natural end. You've walked through every hour of a baker's night, felt the cold seep through stone, understood the calculations that determine who sleeps where, experienced the fear of fire, and the gratitude for warmth, witnessed the rituals and remedies and desperate innovations that medieval people employed to survive what should have killed them. The bakers who lived these nights have been gone for 700 years. Their names are forgotten, their individual struggles unrecorded, their voices silenced by time. But the shape of their survival remains in the placement of ovens near sleeping chambers, in the folk wisdom about layered wool and communal warmth, in the very structure of medieval buildings that were designed however imperfectly to help human beings endure the brutal winters that defined their world. And perhaps in some small way, by spending these hours inhabiting their experience, by feeling what they felt and understanding what they understood, we've brought them briefly back to life. Not as historical abstractions or medieval stereotypes, but as real people who got cold and tired and scared, who developed solutions that mostly worked, who loved warmth and feared fire and treasured the small comforts that made life bearable. The castle is sleeping now. The ovens are silent. The cold presses against every surface. And somewhere in that darkness, wrapped in wool and sustained by community, and warmed by the memory of fire, the bakers rest as best they can, knowing that tomorrow will demand everything they have and somehow they'll find a way to give it. The story ends here. See you in the next video. Good night.